Renee Calloway had $38 in her checking account on the morning Harold Pruitt called. She was standing in the break room at Mercer's Distribution, eating a granola bar that counted as lunch. The vending machine had taken a dollar bill and then done nothing, which cost her 10 minutes of arguing with a machine that was not listening before she gave up and walked to her locker for the backup bar she'd packed that morning. Her break was 45 minutes. Not long enough to drive anywhere and come back. The coffee she'd made 2 hours ago had gone cold on the table beside her phone, but she drank it anyway because she was the kind of tired that needed something warm even when warm was no longer accurate. By the end of this story, I'm also going to share something special with those of you who stick around to the end, something that can help you in your personal life. But first, let's get back to her phone buzzed. Unknown number. Virginia area code. She almost let it go to voicemail. She'd been screening calls for 3 weeks because the credit card company had started routing from numbers that looked local and legitimate, and she didn't have anything new to tell them. A Virginia number probably meant the same. But her shift manager was watching through the glass partition with the particular attention of someone who had nothing better to do, and answering a call looked more purposeful than standing alone in a break room over a granola bar. So she picked up. The voice on the other end was careful and unhurried. A lawyer's voice, the kind trained to carry complicated news without inflection. Miss Calloway, my name is Harold Pruitt. I'm calling on behalf of the estate of Eleanor Marie Calloway. I'm sorry for your loss. Renee put the granola bar down on the table. Her mother had been dead for 2 weeks by the time she heard. That was the kind of relationship they'd had. News traveled through a cousin in Harrisonburg, then an old neighbor, eventually reaching Renee through a text message from a woman she hadn't spoken to in 4 years. Eleanor Calloway, 71, passed peacefully at her home in Greers Mill, Virginia. No service planned. No service held. The text came in at 9:40 on a Tuesday night, and Renee had read it sitting on the edge of the tub while Josie finished brushing her teeth in the sink beside her. Renee hadn't cried when she found out. That bothered her more than the news itself. She'd sat in the parking lot of Josie's school the next morning in the 10 minutes before pickup and tried to locate something that matched the occasion. Grief was somewhere in there, she suspected, but it was buried under years of distance and too many conversations that had ended without resolution, without anyone saying the thing that needed to be said. What surfaced first was something closer to recognition. The quiet arrival of a fact she'd been bracing against without quite admitting it. Harold Pruitt explained the situation with the efficiency of a man billing by the hour. Eleanor had no other surviving family. There was a property on Copeland Road in Greers Mill, 6.5 acres with a main residence, 2 outbuildings, and a greenhouse structure occupying roughly 1 acre of land. Property taxes were 14 months in arrears. No liquid assets in the estate. He'd spent 3 weeks locating Renee as the sole heir before finally reaching her through the county records for her vehicle registration. You have a choice, he said. You can disclaim the inheritance, in which case the county absorbs the property toward the tax debt. Or you can accept it, assume the liability, and take possession. How much are the back taxes? $11,420. Renee looked at the cold coffee. She looked at the granola bar. What's the property worth? A pause that answered the question before the words did. It's rural. The structures need significant work. A comparable recent sale in the area placed similar land at $40,000 to $50,000. Though that figure assumes the buyer can manage some repairs without hiring contractors for everything. So, a property worth perhaps $50,000 if everything went well, with $11,000 in immediate debt attached to it. And she had $38,000 in her account. She thanked him and took down his number and stood in the break room long after the call ended, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and someone's radio 2 rooms over playing something slow and indistinct. Renee had grown up on that property, not in the current house, but in the air of it, in the particular small world Eleanor Calloway had spent her entire adult life cultivating. Her mother grew things the way other people breathed. It was not a hobby or a pastime. It was the one form of expression Eleanor trusted. When Renee was 7, Eleanor had taken her through the original greenhouse, a modest structure then, a lean-to built against the south wall of the main house with corrugated fiberglass panels that let through a warm, diffused light. Seedlings in their small plastic cells, each one labeled in Eleanor's precise handwriting. Latin names Renee couldn't read yet. Eleanor would say each one aloud with the same care she applied to everything, without performance, without decoration. Just the fact of the living thing and its proper name. That lean-to grew. By the time Renee was in middle school, Eleanor had expanded it twice. By high school, she'd begun construction on a separate permanent structure at the back of the property. Purpose-built. Double-pane glass panels and a steel frame and a heating system that cost more than most of Eleanor's neighbors made in a year. People in Greer's Mill talked about this, the way small towns talk about anything that stands out from the ordinary. They talked about it with the particular enthusiasm of people who consider judgment a form of participation. What kind of woman spent that kind of money on a greenhouse and let the house porch go soft? What was she growing in there that required all that glass and all that steel? Why did Eleanor Calloway spend half her week out in that building instead of showing up at the church potluck or the school board meeting like a normal person? Eleanor never answered any of it. She'd been indifferent to town opinion for as long as Renee could remember. Not hostile, indifferent, which some people found even more difficult to absorb. Renee left for community college in Charlottesville at 18. She came back for holidays for a few years, then less often after she met Daniel at a party for someone she barely knew and made the series of choices that led to marriage, and then a daughter, and then a particular long quiet between herself and Eleanor that neither of them found a way to break. The distance was never dramatic. There was no rupture anyone could have pointed to, no defining moment. Just two women who communicated through practicality rather than words. Both of them waiting for the other to go first, neither of them going first. Daniel hadn't helped. He found Eleanor uncomfortable to be around. Said she made him feel assessed every time they visited. He wasn't entirely wrong. Eleanor had looked at Daniel the way she sometimes looked at a plant that wasn't thriving, with patience and a privately held certainty about how things would eventually go. She'd been right, in the end. But being right didn't bring anyone closer. When Daniel left 2 years ago, he took his name off the lease and left behind a credit card balance in the 5 figures and a 10-year-old who had learned too young how to pack fast and not ask too many questions. Renee had dialed Eleanor's number that night. Let it ring twice. Then she'd hung up because she didn't know yet how to have that conversation, and she told herself she'd call again when she found better words. She never did. Now she sat at the kitchen table of their apartment in Staunton with a legal pad in front of her, running numbers that never came out right. $11,000 due immediately to take possession of a property she'd never asked for. Her next paycheck in 8 days, which would cover the car payment, utilities, and groceries if nothing unexpected happened. Nothing left over. No path from here to $11,000 that didn't require something she didn't have. She worked the morning shift at Mercer's 5 days a week. She cleaned 2 office buildings on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, arriving at 6 and leaving when the floors were done, which was usually close to 10. On her actual days off, she caught up on laundry and made meals she portioned out across the week and helped Josie with whatever she was struggling through in school. There was no surplus in any of it. There hadn't been for 2 years. She called her coworker Denise the next morning. "You're not seriously thinking about it," Denise said. "I'm thinking about it. Renee, honey, a broken-down house in the middle of nowhere. $11,000 in back taxes. A greenhouse your mother sealed up for some reason nobody knows." A pause. Say that out loud slowly. The greenhouse has been sealed since around 2002. 22 years. She stopped letting anyone near it. That's worse, not better. My mother left a letter. It says the greenhouse is the one thing on the property I need to take seriously. Denise was quiet for a moment. She left you an actual letter. In the kitchen. On the table. With my name on it. And she tells you specifically about the greenhouse. She says not to sell anything without opening it first. That there's a key in the barn. That I should go in myself before anyone else does. The line was quiet long enough that Renee could hear a door closing on Denise's end. "Renee," Denise said finally, "I've known you for 3 years. You are one of the smarter people I've met in those 3 years. So I need you to hear me when I say that what you just described sounds like something from a show that ends with someone getting hurt. I know how it sounds. Do you? Because it sounds like your eccentric mother sealed a building on her property for 20 years, left cryptic instructions, and now you're about to drive out there alone. I'm taking Josie." Another exhale. "Take your kid into the potentially dangerous sealed property. Much better. She'll be with me the whole time. We're just going to look. Call me when you get there," Denise said. And call me when you leave. And if you don't call me within 6 hours, I'm calling someone. The drive out was a little over an hour from Staunton. Josie sat in the passenger seat with a library field guide to insects open on her lap, not really reading it, watching the Blue Ridge in the distance as the highway climbed. It was an April Saturday, clear and cold at the edges, the kind of morning that hadn't quite decided whether winter was finished. They stopped in Greer's Mill itself for gas before heading out Copeland Road. The station was a single-pump operation attached to a convenience store that also sold fishing licenses and locally made jam. The man behind the counter was somewhere in his 60s, heavy-set, with the permanent squint of someone who spent time outdoors and had stopped using sunscreen years ago. He saw the address Renee typed into her phone's GPS when she paid for the gas. Copeland Road, he said. It wasn't quite a question. The Calloway property, Renee said. Eleanor Calloway. She was my mother. Something shifted in his face. Not unkind, but complicated. I heard she passed. Sorry for it. He handed back her change. You coming to see about the estate? I inherited it. I'm going out to look at the property. He nodded slowly, the nod of a man processing something he'd already considered. Well, I'll say what I'd want someone to say to me in that situation. That house is going to need a lot of work. The property's been neglected since she got sick. And that greenhouse. He stopped, seemed to reconsider. Well, it's been sealed up for a long time. I know. People used to ask her about it. Your mother. She never answered anyone. After a while we stopped asking. He glanced at Josie, who was examining a display of fishing lures near the door with the focused interest she brought to most things. Some folks thought she'd gone strange. Meant it kindly, more or less. The greenhouse just sat there all those years, and nobody could explain it. He looked back at Renee. Might be nothing in there worth the trouble. Probably is nothing. Probably, Renee said. But if it were my mother, he said, and then stopped again. Well, I'd want to know. They drove the rest of the way to Copeland Road without stopping. The road was paved for the first half-mile past the town limit, then turned to gravel, and the property appeared through the tree line before the driveway did. The roofline first, a 2-story frame structure in paint gone gray with age. Then the outbuildings, a small barn and a tool shed. And beyond all of it, visible even from the road because of its size, the greenhouse. Renee pulled the car onto the gravel shoulder and stopped. From 200 yards away, the greenhouse dominated everything around it. 60 feet long at least. The steel frame was solid despite the rust at the corners where decades of weather had worked at it. The glass panels were intact. Not a single one broken or missing across the whole structure. But from here, even at this distance, something about the light coming through them was wrong. Mom. Josie was already looking at it. The glass is dark. She was right. The panels were coated on the inside with something. A dark film, applied evenly, blocking any view of what was inside. Not dirty glass, not simply neglected. Applied deliberately. Every panel treated the same way, no gaps, no variation. Whatever Eleanor had put in that greenhouse, she'd made absolutely certain no one could see it from the outside. They got out of the car. The driveway was overgrown. The gravel buried under 2 or 3 seasons of grass and weeds growing up through it. They walked up together, Renee carrying the envelope Harold Pruitt had mailed her with the property keys, for on a plain ring, each labeled in handwriting she assumed was Pruitt's. Josie had her backpack on and her sketchbook under one arm. The porch boards held their weight, though one corner had gone soft with rot. The front door opened stiffly, the frame settled over years of heat and cold, but it opened. And the smell of the interior stopped Renee in the threshold for a moment she hadn't prepared for. Old wood, dried herbs, something she couldn't separate into its components that was specific to this house and no other, to Eleanor's particular way of living in a space. It came back completely, the way smells do, bypassing everything rational and arriving somewhere older. Renee had not smelled this smell in over a decade, and it arrived now with the weight of a full memory. A summer afternoon when she was 9, sitting on the kitchen floor while Eleanor worked at the counter above her. The smell of whatever was hanging from the back hallway, ceiling mixing with bread cooling on the stove. She stood in the threshold for a moment and then stepped inside. The house was more intact than she'd expected. Furniture still in place. A couch against the far wall covered with a faded quilt. A rocking chair positioned near the window, its seat worn flat from years of use. The kitchen table with 2 chairs, a ceramic salt and pepper set in the center that Renee remembered from childhood, still sitting exactly where it had always sat. The pantry held rows of Eleanor's sealed canning jars, labeled in her hand by year and contents. All of it still here. Eleanor's entire accumulated life still sitting where she'd left it, as if she'd simply gone somewhere and hadn't come back yet. Josie moved through the rooms without touching anything, the way she moved through new spaces, gathering information. Her books are still here, she called from the side room. The study was off the main hall, a small room with shelves on 3 walls that Eleanor had filled with her specific and considered library. Plant taxonomy texts, soil science, mineralogy, chemistry, several volumes in German and Dutch, a row of spiral notebooks that appeared to be field journals, each one labeled on the spine with a year going back to 1974. And on the desk, beside a ceramic mug full of pencils and a reading lamp with a worn shade, a photograph lying face down on the surface. Renee picked it up and turned it over. An elderly man, white-haired and thin, standing in a greenhouse beside Eleanor. Neither of them was looking at the camera. Both of them were looking at something outside the frame with the absorbed, intent attention of people who had just seen something that required their full concentration. Eleanor was smiling. Not the small, contained expression Renee knew. Something fuller than that. Something she couldn't remember seeing on her mother's face. She turned the photograph over. In Eleanor's handwriting on the back, Anton, 1998. Lelie, Botanica. Renee stood with the photograph for a moment. Then she put it in her jacket pocket. Josie found the letter herself. She'd been working through the kitchen methodically, opening drawers the way she investigated everything, with calm, systematic curiosity. The junk drawer yielded it. An unsealed envelope with Renee written on the front in Eleanor's handwriting. They are always made a size larger than the other letters. Renee sat at the kitchen table and read it. The letter was 2 pages in Eleanor's careful script, and it read the way Eleanor had always spoken. Without preamble. Without anything softened unnecessarily. The first sentence was, "I expect you'll come eventually, because you're more like me than either of us was ever willing to say out loud." Eleanor covered the practical matters first. The property was Renee's to decide about. The back taxes were a genuine burden, and she was sorry for that. The pantry was stocked and would feed someone through the spring. The heating system in the main house needed a new thermostat by fall. Then, the greenhouse was the one thing on the property Renee needed to take seriously before making any decision about the land. There was a key in the barn, brass, on a red ring. Use it at the greenhouse door. It would make more sense once she was holding it. There was a brief note about Josie. Eleanor wrote that Josie had Eleanor's hands, based on the photograph Renee had sent from the school winter concert. She hoped the girl knew what to do with them. The last paragraph was 2 sentences. "I should have said more to you. I didn't know how to start, and then too much time passed, and I still didn't know how. And I'm sorry for giving you that same problem." Josie had read it over Renee's shoulder, which she often did with things she found important. When Renee looked up, her daughter was watching her with that particular expression she had when she was processing more than she was saying. "She left you a key," Josie said. "In the barn. For the greenhouse. That's what it says." Josie unzipped her backpack and handed Renee one of the granola bars she'd packed without being asked. Then she went to find her sketchbook. The barn sat behind the main house, a small wooden structure with a loft Josie examined thoroughly while Renee worked the main floor. Inside, garden tools hung in organized rows on the walls, terracotta pots stacked carefully in size order, bags of soil amendment, and bone meal labeled by type and date of purchase. Pruning shears in 6 different sizes, hanging handles down on their hooks. Everything organized and labeled with the specific logic Eleanor applied to anything she maintained. Nothing kept out of habit. Everything kept because it served a purpose she'd considered. On the back wall, a pegboard with hooks holding various keys, each one marked in Eleanor's handwriting on a small card. The brass key on the red ring was exactly where the letter said, heavier than expected when Renee lifted it from the hook. The profile of the key was unusual, the cuts arranged in a complex pattern she didn't recognize as standard. On the red ring, a small tag in Eleanor's writing, "The house," which was odd, given that it was in the barn. But Eleanor's logic had always operated on principles that weren't always visible from the outside. They walked back across the property. The afternoon had deepened while they were in the house, the light changing from morning flat to the warmer angle of midday passing toward afternoon, and the air was colder now with a breeze coming off the tree-line at the property's back edge. A woodpecker was working at something in the pines. Their footsteps through the grass were quiet. Close to the greenhouse, the scale of it was different than from the road. It was large enough to feel like a separate place, a separate world. The steel frame was solid, rust along the corners and at the base of some of the vertical supports, but nothing compromised. Every glass panel intact and treated with the same dark film on the interior surface, applied with an even hand, covering every inch. The main door was set into the end wall facing them. Steel, with no exterior handle. No window. A single keyhole at chest height, and around the keyhole a machined steel plate that looked heavier and more precise than the doors on the main house. The keyhole's profile matched the key in Renee's hand. She fitted the key in and turned it. Not the sound of a lock releasing. Something else. A sequence of mechanical clicks from inside the door, deliberate, like a sequence of tumblers engaging rather than disengaging. Then silence. The door didn't move. Josie had crouched down and was examining the plate around the keyhole from close range. She pressed her fingertip into the keyhole and then pulled it back. "There are 2 keyholes," she said. "The second one is set back inside the first. Maybe 2 inches in. Smaller profile, different cut." Renee looked. Her daughter was right. One key turned a mechanism. A second key was required to release it. Eleanor had built a door that needed both simultaneously, and the letter had mentioned only one key. The second key was somewhere on this property. Eleanor had put it somewhere else, somewhere that required Renee to actually look. They went back to the house and searched systematically. Kitchen drawers checked twice. The study shelves examined book by book, shaking each one gently for anything tucked inside. The bathroom cabinet, the hall closet, the cellar door, which turned out to open onto a root cellar with nothing in it but empty wooden shelves and the smell of old earth. Josie took the barn loft apart. Renee checked the tool shed, opening every container, lifting every tarpaulin from the stored equipment inside. They found it in Eleanor's bedroom. A small key on a plain ring, sitting in a ceramic bowl on top of the dresser alongside 2 buttons, a folded grocery receipt, and a rubber band. The metal of it was darker than the brass key, a different composition, with a recessed profile that matched the second keyhole in the greenhouse door. On the bottom of the ceramic bowl, visible only when Renee lifted it, a strip of masking tape in Eleanor's handwriting, "For when you're ready." Renee stood in her mother's bedroom with a key in each hand. The afternoon light came through the window at a low angle and lay across the dresser and the old quilt on the single bed and the bowl she'd just put back down. She had come out here that morning expecting to make a practical decision about a piece of property no one else wanted. She had come prepared to confirm that the greenhouse was probably full of dead plants and rusted equipment, that the sensible thing was to disclaim the inheritance and let the county have it. That sentimentality was a luxury she couldn't afford this year. She had not expected any of this. 2 separate keyholes. A photograph of a white-haired man Renee had never met. A letter from a woman who'd spent her entire adult life unable to say the important things aloud. And a note at the bottom of a ceramic bowl that said, "For when you're ready," placed by a woman who'd sealed a greenhouse for 22 years and was trusting her daughter to find the way inside. "Are we going?" Josie said from the doorway. Renee looked at the keys in her hands. "Yeah," she said. "We're going." The configuration at the greenhouse door was awkward. Both keys in at once, her hands stacked on each other in the narrow space. The brass key in the outer lock and the smaller key inserted into the recessed inner keyhole with the brass key still engaged. She turned the brass key first. The familiar sequence of clicks ran through. Then she turned the smaller key. The door opened inward. There was resistance before it moved. A seal, she realized, a gasket compressed around the entire door frame, releasing with a soft expulsion of air that sounded almost like a breath. The air that came out was warm, alive, green and dense and humid, the concentrated smell of growing things in an enclosed space, layered and complex. Not the stale dead air of a room sealed for 2 decades. Living air, plant air, the particular smell of photosynthesis and damp soil and green growth happening continuously. Renee recognized the smell from her childhood and stood in the doorway for a moment unable to move. Josie stepped inside first. The interior light was unlike anything Renee had expected. The dark film on the panels didn't block all the light. It filtered it, transformed it into something low and even and green, a diffused quality that made the space feel like looking through water, everything visible but softened, suspended. The kind of light that existed in no other context she'd ever been in. And in that light, the greenhouse was full. Not wild, not overgrown with neglect. Cultivated, dense with intention. Raised growing beds lined both long walls of the structure, built from cedar boards that had weathered to silver. Hanging baskets suspended from the overhead steel frame in rows, trailing plants whose names Renee didn't know. Down the center aisle, specimen pots in organized groupings, each one labeled at the base. And all of it, every last plant, growing. Alive, green in various shades and textures. The complex living density of a collection that had been maintained by someone who understood every single thing it needed. Eleanor had been dead for 2 weeks. She had been ill and largely confined for months before that. "How are they alive?" Josie said. It came out barely above a whisper. Renee found the answer along the right wall, at the base of the first raised bed. A network of irrigation pipes, slender and precisely fitted with drip emitters positioned at the base of each plant. The pipes ran back to a timer box mounted on the wall near the door, its digital display still running, programming still intact. Automated watering, set to run on its own schedule indefinitely, no human intervention required. Temperature control came from a separate system, a small heating unit mounted high on the near wall connected to its own thermostat. The display near the door read 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Consistent and stable. Eleanor had engineered this greenhouse to maintain itself without her. She had thought through every requirement and automated every system she could automate, so that even when she was sick, even when she couldn't walk out here herself, even after she was gone, the plants would continue growing, continue living, continue covering whatever they were planted above. Renee walked the center aisle slowly, looking at what her mother had spent decades cultivating in here. She recognized some of it. Rosemary in large pots, lavender, several herb varieties she knew by sight. A climbing plant on a frame she'd seen in Eleanor's lean-to when she was small. But most of the collection was unfamiliar. Specimens she couldn't name, their labels giving Latin nomenclature and a date of collection or acquisition. The oldest label she found was dated 1979. Some of these plants had been growing in Eleanor's care for 45 years. Josie was working the left side of the greenhouse with her sketchbook out, making quick sketches as she moved, noting the names on labels, the arrangement of pots. She had the focused quiet of someone doing something she found genuinely interesting. "Mom," she called from the far end. "Come look at this." At the back wall, where the center aisle ended, a workbench ran the full width of the greenhouse. Potting soil in sealed containers. Clean tools in an organized row. Small labeled trays of seeds, several of them years old by the dates written on them. Everything maintained with Eleanor's consistent and specific logic. And above the workbench, where a window might have been expected, a corkboard covered the full width of the back wall between 2 steel uprights. Large, covered with materials pinned in careful arrangement, nothing overlapping, nothing placed without intention. Maps, hand-drawn on drafting paper, with annotations in at least 3 different handwriting styles. Photographs of objects and of places Renee didn't recognize. Pages cut from what appeared to be academic journals, the text too small to read from a step away. Letters and languages she couldn't identify. Postcards. And at the center of the board, set slightly apart from everything else, anchoring the whole arrangement, a photograph of a wooden case resting on a table beside a metal ruler placed for scale. The case was perhaps 18 inches long and 12 inches wide. Dark wood with lighter inlaid patterns running along the edges, and fitted into the front of the case, a lock shaped like a flower. 6 petals arranged around a center, stylized and precise, with a keyhole set at the middle of the design. In the photograph, the case was closed. On the table beside it, a small white card with handwriting too small and too far away to read clearly. Pinned below the photograph, separately, was a note in Eleanor's handwriting. Lelie Botanica Collection, complete, verified, 2001. 1,847 specimens, 83 classified exceptional. Anton's life's work. Renee read it 3 times. What does Lelie Botanica mean? Josie asked. She'd been reading the board from left to right, systematically, the way she read everything. Renee pulled at a fragment of memory from years of hearing plant names in this woman's voice. Before we find out what happened next in the story, I want to take a brief moment to speak directly to anyone watching who might be going through their own sudden, overwhelming transition. If you are navigating a bitter divorce, the loss of a spouse, or a financial shock, you know the hardest part isn't just the money. It's not knowing what to do first. That is exactly why we created the Phoenix Blueprint. It is a practical, step-by-step guide for starting over. It doesn't have fluffy affirmations or vision boards. It is a tactical survival manual. It gives you the exact checklist for the first 48 hours, including the one rule you must follow. Do not make any decision you cannot reverse. It includes the Found Money worksheet, showing you exactly how to check state databases because 1 in 7 Americans actually has unclaimed money waiting for them right now. It even gives you word-for-word boundary scripts to use when family members pressure you for money or try to make decisions for you. You can get the entire guide right now for just $17. If you're watching on your TV, just pull out your phone, open your camera, and scan the QR code on the screen right now. If you're on a computer or phone, click the top link in the description. You don't have to figure this out alone. Now, let's get back to the story. Lelie. She'd heard Eleanor use it once, or more than once, in what she now recognized as Dutch. Lelie, she said slowly. Botanical lily collection. Something along those lines. Josie was still reading. She moved to a clipping from what was clearly a Dutch newspaper, yellowed at the edges and pinned carefully flat. She pointed to a word that appeared 3 times in the body of the article. Diamond. The greenhouse was quiet except for the faint mechanical sound of the irrigation timer cycling. Outside, the afternoon had shifted further toward evening, and the filtered light through the panels was changing from green to something darker, more amber. Renee's French was middling at best, but the cognate was clear enough. Diamond. She turned away from the corkboard and looked at the floor. At the far end of the greenhouse, beneath the last raised growing bed on the right side, the flooring changed. The rest of the greenhouse floor was concrete, clean, and even. But in this one section, set flush with the concrete around it, and distinguishable only by the difference in material and color, was a steel plate, roughly 4 feet by 4 feet, and recessed into the surface of the steel plate, folded flat into a groove machine to receive it, was a ring handle. A trapdoor, set beneath Eleanor's growing bed, in a sealed greenhouse on 6.5 acres of rural Virginia land, on a property nobody wanted. Renee straightened and looked at it. Josie stood beside her. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The plants rustled faintly in the temperature-controlled air. The irrigation timer ran quietly along the right wall. Above them, the filtered evening light moved across the dark film on the panels. Renee thought about Anton, the white-haired man in the photograph from Eleanor's study, standing beside Eleanor in a greenhouse in 1998, both of them looking at something outside the frame. She thought about the Dutch newspaper article and the word diamond appearing 3 times in a text she couldn't read. She thought about a wooden case with a flower-shaped lock, photographed on a table beside a ruler for scale. 1,847 specimens. 83 classified exceptional. Anton's life's work. She thought about Eleanor sealing this greenhouse in 2002. 3 years after that photograph was taken. 3 years after 1998. And maintaining it, running irrigation, keeping the temperature stable, keeping the door locked against anyone who might open it, for 22 years. Alone. The trapdoor was within reach. She could crouch down and pull that ring handle right now. She didn't. We're going to come back, she said. Josie looked at her without surprise. I want to find out who Anton was first. What the Lelie Botanica collection is. What she was protecting and why she was protecting it, and from who. Renee looked at the corkboard one more time, at the maps and letters and photographs and the central image of the flower-locked case. She kept this for 22 years, and she never told anyone. Not even me. Whatever this is, I want to understand it before I open that door. Josie looked at the trapdoor one last time. Then she looked at her mother. Okay, she said. But we're coming back. We're coming back. They locked the greenhouse door behind them on the way out, both keys in the proper order, hearing the mechanism re-engage. The property was quiet in the early evening, the woodpecker gone, the wind dropping, the light turning the flat gold of the last hour before dark. The drive home was quiet. Josie fell asleep past Waynesboro with her sketchbook open on her lap, quick drawings visible on the pages. The greenhouse interior, the arrangement of plants, the corkboard with its maps and photographs, the four-petaled flower lock on the wooden case, the outline of the trapdoor, with a single question mark written beneath it in Josie's careful hand. Renee drove through the dark and thought about her mother. Eleanor Marie Calloway had spent the last 22 years of her life maintaining a sealed greenhouse on a rural Virginia property. She'd automated the irrigation so the plants would survive her. She'd built a door with 2 separate locks and hidden the keys in 2 separate places that required actual searching to find. She'd pinned 22 years of accumulated documentation to a corkboard in the back of that greenhouse. Newspaper articles in Dutch, maps with annotations in multiple hands, photographs of a wooden case that contained something described as one man's life's work. She'd never told a single person. Not Harold Pruitt. Not the cousin in Harrisonburg. Not Renee. She'd paid her property taxes 14 months late and let the porch go soft and the driveway go to grass rather than draw anyone's attention to the property, rather than give anyone reason to look too closely at what she was keeping. And 3 weeks before she died, she'd written a letter and left it on the kitchen table with her daughter's name on the envelope. The letter that said the greenhouse was the one thing that mattered. That said take it seriously. That ended with 2 sentences about everything that had gone unsaid between them for too long. For when you're ready. Renee had $38 in her account and $11,000 in tax debt and a piece of rural Virginia land that nobody wanted and that everybody in Greer's Mill had quietly given up on. She had a 10-year-old in the passenger seat with drawings of a trapdoor in her sketchbook. She had a brass key on a red ring and a second key from a ceramic bowl and a corkboard full of maps and photographs and Dutch newspaper articles about diamonds. She had a mother she'd never understood and was beginning to. She was not disclaiming this inheritance. She was coming back. She was going to find out who Anton was, and what the Lelie Botanica collection held, and what Eleanor Calloway had spent 22 years protecting in a sealed greenhouse in the Shenandoah Valley. She was going to find out what was beneath that trapdoor. And whatever was down there, she was going to face it the same way her mother had faced everything, without flinching, without explaining herself to anyone who hadn't earned the explanation, and with the particular, stubborn patience of a woman who understood that the most important things took time and care and the willingness to stay. The first thing she searched for was the name from the photograph. Anton. Lelie Botanica. She added Belgium, because something about the language on the corkboard had felt Dutch or Flemish, and because the word diamond belonged to a language rooted in Antwerp, which was where the diamond trade had lived for centuries. She was sitting at the kitchen table at 11 at night with her laptop open and a glass of water she kept forgetting to drink. The apartment was quiet, Josie asleep, the street outside carrying only the occasional sound of a passing car. She'd arranged the photographs she'd taken that day across the table surface. The corkboard photographs, printed at the drugstore on the drive home. The keys. The photograph of the man called Anton, printed separately, with Eleanor's rare, open smile beside him. The first search result was in Dutch. She clicked through to a machine translation that came back rough in places, strange word choices where the original resisted clean conversion, but the substance came through clearly enough. Anton Vellier, 1910 to 1999. Born in Antwerp. Trained in gemology in the late 1920s under the firm of Clays and Vermeers. Active in the Antwerp diamond trade through the 1930s. In 1940, with German occupation of Belgium underway, Vellier had already established relationships with significant collectors and dealers, many of them Jewish, many of them facing organized confiscation under the occupation's racial laws. Over the following 2 years, he had accepted custody of several substantial collections from families who were trying to protect their assets before it was too late. In 1943, he managed to leave for Portugal with what documentation he could carry. From Lisbon, he reached New York. He never returned to Belgium. In New York, he established himself as a dealer and, with time, as a recognized figure in the world of colored stones. He built relationships with dealers and collectors and the emerging institutions of professional gemological certification. He added to what he carried from Europe, piece by careful piece, over decades, through legitimate purchase. Through recovering pieces scattered by the war that needed to come home to someone who understood their importance. He called the resulting collection the Lelie Botanica, after the hand-painted botanical plates depicting Belgian field lilies that he had fitted into the interior lids of the walnut cases he commissioned for the stones. He maintained a precise catalog of every specimen, cross-referenced with photographs and, where available, provenance documentation going back decades. He died in 1999 at 89 in his apartment on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. His estate had listed significant debts and no significant assets. The Lelie Botanica collection was not found among his effects. Renee read that line 3 times. A 2003 article in a specialized gem trade journal described the collection as among the notable unresolved disappearances in the world of colored diamond collecting. A specialist quoted in the article, someone who had done valuation work for Lelie in the 1990s, described it as extraordinary in its breadth. The 83 specimens Lelie himself classified as exceptional represented, the specialist said, one of the finest concentrations of rare colored diamonds he had encountered under a single private ownership in his career. Near the end of the article, almost as a footnote, a 1998 partial valuation, submitted by Lelie for insurance purposes, had placed the value of those 83 exceptional specimens at $62 million. Renee sat without moving for a moment. In 1998, colored diamond values had not stood still in the decades since. The Argyle mine in Western Australia, source of the majority of the world's rare pink diamonds, had operated until 2020 and then closed permanently. Permanently meant no new supply. No new supply against sustained and growing collector demand meant prices that moved in one direction without hesitation. The last major Argyle pink diamond auction had produced per-carat prices that made 1998 figures look like estimates from a different economic era, which they effectively were. She did not have the expertise to run precise numbers. She didn't need to. The shape of what the math meant was clear enough. $62 million for 83 stones in 1998. The collection held 1,847 specimens in total. Those 83 had been the exceptional ones, the smallest fraction of the whole, the ones Lelie had submitted for partial valuation while keeping everything else undocumented. Her mother had been living on a rural Virginia property, 14 months behind on property taxes, alone, with this under her greenhouse. Renee closed the laptop. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time. She thought about Eleanor at the original lean-to in 1980, saying the Latin names of seedlings with the same patient exactness she applied to everything. She thought about the large greenhouse going up in sections, the steel frame appearing above the tree line of Copeland Road when Renee was 16, and thinking it was just another of Eleanor's projects that didn't require explanation. She thought about the phone calls that grew less frequent and the visits that stopped, and the years she'd let accumulate while she wasn't paying attention. She thought about her mother in 2002, making a decision the rest of the world knew nothing about, sealing a door, running automated irrigation above a secret she was going to carry until she died. Which she had. She went to bed and lay awake for 2 hours before sleep found her. In the morning she called Harold Pruitt. She asked him whether there had been any correspondence related to the estate from outside parties. Any inquiries or claims he was aware of since Eleanor's death. A brief pause. There was a letter from a Belgian holding company. Lelie Erfgoed BV. They claimed Mrs. Calloway had been in possession of property that legally belonged to the estate of Anton Lelie. The letter was a preliminary inquiry, vague on specifics, and without supporting documentation. I wrote back requesting clarification and haven't received a response. When did it arrive? Approximately 6 weeks before Mrs. Calloway's death. Renee kept her voice even. Do you know anything about the company itself? I didn't research it in depth. It was a standard letterhead with a Brussels address. Nothing I could act on without more substance. A pause. Miss Calloway, is there something relevant you'd like to share with me about the property? Not yet, she said. Give me a little more time. She called Denise next. I found out who Anton was, she said. And he was a Belgian gemologist. He died in 1999. He gave my mother his collection before he died. What kind of collection? The kind with a 1998 partial valuation of $62 million. The silence on Denise's end lasted several seconds. Renee, that's for the exceptional portion only. There are 1,847 pieces in the full collection. Another silence, longer. Are you telling me there is something worth potentially hundreds of millions of dollars underneath your dead mother's greenhouse? There's a trapdoor in the floor. I haven't opened it yet. And a Belgian company has been sending letters. To the estate, yes. Denise's voice came back careful and measured. Renee, listen to me. Before you open anything, you need a lawyer who works in property and estate law, not a general practice lawyer. Someone who specifically understands contested inheritance and international claims. I can't afford that right now. You can't afford not to have it if what you're describing is real. Tell me you understand that. I understand. Nobody else knows about this. Just you. Keep it that way until you've been inside and you know exactly what you have. Then you call me and we figure out the next step together. A pause. And Renee, if that Belgian company is sending men to look at the property, which I suspect they might be, you need to move faster than they're moving. Renee looked at the photograph of Anton Vellier on her kitchen table. The white-haired man with his eyes on something outside the frame, with Eleanor's rare and open smile beside him. I'm going back this weekend, she said. Then go. The following Saturday, she and Josie drove back to Greer's Mill. This time Renee packed differently. The heavy flashlight, a spare, 2 portable battery chargers for her phone, a notebook, rubber gloves, because she didn't know what she'd be handling and she didn't want to damage it. And at Josie's quiet insistence, the field guide to insects, which had started to feel like a talisman. They stopped at the convenience store on the way through town for water and fuel for the drive back. The same man was behind the counter. When Renee set the water bottles down, he recognized her, and his expression carried something she hadn't seen on the first visit. You're back, he said. Came out to look at the property again. He rang up the bottles slowly. Someone else came through asking about the Calloway place, he said without looking up. 2 days ago, a man I didn't know said he was from a property assessment company, but he had no equipment, and assessment companies always file with the county before they look at anything. Renee kept her face still. What did he look like? Your age, maybe a little older. Wearing clothes that were too good for a county road. Drove a rental with out-of-state plates. He handed her the change and looked at her directly. I told him I didn't know much about the property. He asked about the greenhouse specifically. Renee met his eyes. Thank you for telling me. Just thought you should know. He turned back to the counter. Be careful out there. A dark sedan was parked on the gravel shoulder of Copeland Road when they turned onto it, 200 yards from the Calloway driveway. Engine off. No one visible inside from this distance. As Renee pulled past the overgrown gate and into the property, the sedan's engine started. By the time she'd parked and gotten out of the car, it was gone. Josie watched the road where the car had been. Someone was watching. Yes. From the Belgian company. Renee looked at her daughter. How do you know about the Belgian company? A brief pause. The walls are thin, and you were on the phone with Denise. Renee took a slow breath. We're going to talk about what I know before we go inside. All of it. They sat in the car. Renee explained what she'd found about Anton Vellier, the Lelie Botanica collection, the 1998 valuation, and the letter Harold Pruitt had received. She kept it factual and straightforward, the way Eleanor had always given information, without softening it into something it wasn't. Josie listened without interrupting once. When Renee finished, Josie was quiet for a moment. Then, what's in the trapdoor? I think it's the collection. The one worth hundreds of millions. That's what I need to find out. Josie looked at the greenhouse at the back of the property, standing in the flat April light. Then we should go find out. They went into the house first. Something had been bothering Renee since the previous weekend, a feeling of having walked past something without seeing it. In Eleanor's study, she had checked the obvious drawer in the desk and found it empty. But there was a second drawer, narrower, fitted below the left one. She had tried the door on it on the first visit and found it locked, and had moved on because she hadn't had the full ring of keys with her then. She had the full ring now. The fourth key fit. The drawer opened. Inside, a manila envelope, sealed, with one word written on the front in Eleanor's handwriting. Anton. She spread the contents on the desk. 3 documents, each in a clear plastic sleeve. The first was correspondence. For letters from Vellier Erfgoed BV, a holding company incorporated in Brussels. The letters were written in formal English with the particular stiffness of legal language translated from another tongue. They claimed, in escalating firmness across 4 exchanges, that Eleanor Calloway was in possession of property belonging to the estate of Anton Vellier. that the property had been transferred to her in an arrangement that Vellier's rightful heirs had never sanctioned, that its return was expected within a reasonable period or legal action would follow. The most recent letter was dated 4 months before Eleanor's death. The second document was Eleanor's response. 2 sentences in her handwriting, never sent. I am in possession of what Anton gave me freely, with full legal authority, because he trusted me to keep it safe. He had reason not to trust anyone else. The third document was the most important. A notarized transfer agreement dated March 19, 1999. Anton Vellier's name at the top. Eleanor Marie Calloway's below it. 2 witness signatures. And in the margin, in Anton's own handwriting, a statement that cut through everything else on the page. I give this freely and of sound mind to the one person I trust to protect it until protection is no longer necessary. Notarized. Witnessed. Legal in every respect that mattered. Eleanor had never sent it to anyone. She'd kept it in a locked drawer for 22 years, and she'd kept the greenhouse locked above it, and she'd told no one. The Belgian company had sent 4 letters and received no response. They'd kept sending because they had no documentation of their own to act on, nothing to prove their claim, nothing but the belief that the collection existed and should belong to them. Eleanor had held the legal proof that it didn't and had chosen silence over conflict, because silence meant the collection stayed hidden and hidden meant it stayed safe. She was protecting it, Josie said, reading over Renee's shoulder. She was. Even after she had the paperwork to prove it was hers, she still didn't tell anyone. Renee looked at the draft response. He had reason not to trust anyone else. Anton Vellier had spent 40 years building a collection that came to him partly through an act of preservation during one of the worst periods of organized theft in the last century. He had spent the rest of his life maintaining those stones, documenting them, and at the end he'd transferred them to the one person he believed would protect what he'd spent his life protecting. Eleanor had accepted the responsibility, not because she understood the gem trade or had connections or resources, because she was the kind of person who kept what she was given to keep. And she'd kept it, without complaint and without explanation and without telling a single person, including her daughter, for 22 years. Renee put the documents back in their sleeves and put the sleeves back in the envelope. She put the envelope in her bag. Okay, she said. Let's go. They walked across the property in the April afternoon. The light came down at a low angle through the trees at the back edge of the land, and the greenhouse sat where it always had, glass dark, steel frame solid, door sealed. Everything exactly as Eleanor had left it. Renee used both keys. The brass key in the outer lock. The smaller key fitted simultaneously into the inner keyhole, hands stacked, the mechanical click of the mechanism engaging, the door swinging inward on the gasket seal with the same warm breath of living air. The plants were as they had been, living and dense and specific in the diffused light. Renee noticed things she hadn't on the first visit, now that she wasn't operating entirely on adrenaline. The plants were old. Many of them had the root-bound patience of specimens that had been growing for decades. Eleanor had not planted these for show. She'd planted them to last, to survive any period of neglect or absence, to continue covering what they covered regardless of who was there to tend them. They walked the center aisle. Josie touched nothing. At the far end, beneath the last raised growing bed on the right, the steel trapdoor sat flush in the floor exactly where they'd left it. The ring handle folded flat in its groove. Renee crouched. She gripped the ring handle and pulled. The trapdoor was heavy, solid steel, but it moved on a counterbalanced hinge that made the initial resistance give way more smoothly than the weight alone would have suggested. The panel came up and settled back against the leg of the growing bed with a low, final sound. A ladder went down. Wooden rungs fitted to brackets in the stone walls. The flashlight beam went first, and at the bottom of that beam, roughly 10 feet below, a concrete floor and the edges of stone walls and the shapes of things that the angle of light only partially revealed. Renee went down first. The rungs were solid, the construction careful, built by someone who intended it to be used regularly over a long period. 10 feet of descent, and the air changed as she went, shifting from the warm, humid green of the greenhouse above to something cooler and more measured. Controlled. She reached the bottom and swept the flashlight across the space. The chamber was larger than she'd expected, 20 feet by 20 feet at least, with a ceiling that gave her several feet of clearance. Stone walls on all 4 sides, mortared with the deliberate precision of someone who understood that moisture was the enemy. A concrete floor, clean, and along 3 of the 4 walls, shelving built from dark hardwood, fitted and sealed and running from floor to ceiling. On the shelves, cases, 8 of them that she could count from where she stood, with a 9th on the low table at the center of the room. Each one made from the same dark wood she'd seen in the photograph pinned to Eleanor's corkboard. Each one approximately 18 inches long and 12 wide, inlaid along the edges with lighter wooden patterns she recognized now as the Lelie botanical motif that gave the collection its name. Each one fitted on the front with a lock shaped like a 6-petaled flower. Josie came down behind her and stood at the bottom of the ladder, flashlight in hand, looking at the room without speaking for a full 10 seconds. The shelving around the cases held other things as well. Archival file boxes labeled in handwriting Renee didn't recognize, which meant Anton's. A row of flat boxes that might hold maps or large documents. And on the wall beside the nearest shelving, mounted on a hook within easy reach, a small cluster of narrow tools on a ring. The temperature was wrong for an underground chamber. Not cold. Controlled. Renee found the source mounted high on the east wall. A climate unit, small and quiet, running steadily, connected by a conduit that traveled up through the ceiling to the greenhouse systems above. Eleanor had run temperature control into this space, had extended her automated environmental systems down through the floor, keeping the chamber at the same stable conditions that kept the plants alive above. 22 years of consistent temperature and humidity, maintaining 8 cases on wooden shelves in a stone room under a Virginia greenhouse. Renee crossed to the hook on the wall and lifted the ring of tools. Slender, precisely made, the tips shaped to the specific profile of the flower lock. She selected one and carried it to the nearest case on the shelf. Her hands were steady. The tool fit. A small amount of pressure, a specific angle, nothing complicated once the mechanism's logic became clear. The flower lock released with a soft click. She opened the case. Dark blue velvet inside, shaped into individual settings, each one holding a stone. 7 stones in the top row, 8 in the second. The case held close to 60 specimens in total, each sitting in its own velvet nest. They were not large stones. Many of them were what a dealer would call calibrated, stones cut to standard commercial sizes. But when the flashlight beam crossed them, the light behaved differently than it did with ordinary glass or crystal. It entered the stones and changed its character inside them before returning, not scattered but altered, colored in ways that had nothing to do with the surface. Blues, in a row across the upper section. Blues of different intensities, from the near colorless with a trace of blue to the deeply saturated stones that absorbed and returned light like still water on a clear day. Below them, yellows so concentrated they looked like chips of preserved sunlight. And in the center row, 2 pinks separated by a clear stone, the pink on the left a pale, delicate shade, and the pink on the right something richer, more concentrated, a color that seemed to produce its own warmth rather than simply reflecting someone else's light. Josie had come to stand beside her without Renee hearing her move. Neither of them spoke. After a moment, Renee photographed the case from 3 angles, photographed the individual stones in the center row with the camera held close, and closed the case carefully. She moved to the next. Each case was different in its contents, but consistent in its construction and its evident care. The second held stones of different character, lighter yellows and champagnes and cognacs and fancy cuts that caught the flashlight and scattered it in directions that made the chamber feel briefly warmer. The third held emeralds alongside sapphires and shades from the pale near violet to the intensely saturated blue of fine Ceylon stones, and a row of pinkish-orange sapphires that Josie, reading from some fragment of retained information, said might be Padparadska, the rarest sapphire color, named for a lotus flower. The fourth held diamonds. Only diamonds. Rounds and pear shapes and ovals and cushion cuts in colored grades that ran the full spectrum of the classification system, from the faintest detectable tint to the vivid saturated colors that gemologists reserve for the finest examples of what a diamond could be. By the 5th case, Renee had stopped pausing at individual stones and moved into the rhythm of systematic documentation, photographing every case open and closed, photographing individual rows, working through each one with the focused calm that the situation required. The 6th case was different. It sat on the low table at the center of the room rather than on the shelving, set slightly apart from everything else, as if by design rather than by convenience. It was marginally larger than the others, and its lock was different. Not the six-petaled flower, but something more complex, two interlocking petals with a separate keyhole, requiring a different tool from the ring. She tried 3 before she found the one that fit. She opened the case. Inside, the velvet was the same dark blue, but the arrangement was not the efficient rows of the other cases. This was display. Individual stones in their own settings, spaced apart. Each one given room to be seen without competition from its neighbors. 11 stones in total, arranged in a pattern that was clearly intentional rather than practical. The largest sat in the center. A pink diamond. The color was unlike anything in the other cases. It was not pink the way a flower was pink, not pale or delicate or gradated. It was a concentrated, fully saturated color, warm in a way that suggested internal light rather than external reflection, and it was roughly the size of her thumbnail. In the context of rare pink diamonds, that was large. In the context of any pink diamond that anyone could actually buy in the open market, after the Argyle mine's closure, that was extraordinary. She photographed it for a long time before she moved to the stone on its left. A blue diamond, smaller than the pink, deep and saturated, the color that specialists called fancy vivid blue. The grade at the top of the classification system, a color so rarely achieved in nature that diamonds reaching that description sold for the kind of prices that made international news. This one held the flashlight beam the way deep water held a stone dropped into it. It took the light in and did not fully give it back. On the right side of the pink, a stone so small it was barely larger than the nail on her smallest finger. Its color was red. Not modified red, not brownish or purplish or any of the color descriptors that gemologists use to acknowledge that pure red was nearly impossible. Just red. Clear, unmodified, and real. Renee had read, during 2 weeks of research driven by a photograph and a word on a corkboard, that there were fewer than 30 pure red diamonds in the world confirmed to exist. She was looking at one now, in a sealed underground chamber in rural Virginia, in a velvet setting in a walnut case, under a greenhouse full of living plants that had been growing undisturbed for decades. Josie had sat down on the concrete floor at some point while Renee was working through the cases. She sat cross-legged with her sketchbook open, drawing from the photographs on Renee's phone, the layout of the cases on the shelving and the table, the arrangement of stones in the 6th case. The drawings were precise and careful, made with the focus Josie brought to things she wanted to fully understand. Renee photographed the 6th case from every angle, then photographed each of the 11 exceptional stones individually. She photographed the shelving, the walls, the climate unit on the east wall, the ceiling, the ladder rising to the greenhouse above. She photographed the file boxes and the archival flat boxes. She photographed the hook where the tools had hung. Then she sat down on the floor beside her daughter. The flashlights rested between them, aimed upward, filling the chamber with diffused light. Around them the 9 cases held what Anton Vellier had spent 40 years assembling, what families had trusted him with during the worst period any of them had survived, what Eleanor Calloway had spent 22 years maintaining in silence. "It's real," Josie said. "It's real." She said it the same way she said most things, without excess, giving the fact exactly the weight it deserved. Josie had grown up watching her mother absorb difficult realities and keep moving. She knew how to do the same. But they both sat with it for a moment anyway. 22 years of Greer's Mill looking at Eleanor Calloway's sealed greenhouse and thinking the woman had gone strange. 22 years of property taxes paid increasingly late, the porch going soft, the driveway going to grass, the house needing a new thermostat. None of it attended to because the money went somewhere else. 22 years of Renee growing up and leaving and building a life that fell apart and putting it back together and never once pushing past Eleanor's silence to what was actually underneath it. Her mother had carried this entirely alone, had chosen to carry it, had structured her entire life around carrying it, because Anton Vellier had trusted her with the work of his lifetime, and Eleanor Calloway did not put down what she was given to hold. Renee thought about the last line of the letter on the kitchen table. "I should have said more to you. I didn't know how to start, and then too much time passed." She thought about a man dying in a Manhattan apartment in 1999 having spent his entire adult life protecting stones that came to him through other people's fear and desperation, trusting them in the end to a woman in rural Virginia who grew things and kept things and never needed to be the most visible person in the room. She thought about Anton's smile on the other side of Eleanor's smile in the photograph. Two people in a greenhouse in 1998, both of them looking at something that mattered. Josie had moved to a new page of her sketchbook and was drawing the pink diamond from the sixth case, working from the photograph, making the drawing small and exact. She was quiet in the way she was quiet when she was thinking as fast as she was drawing. "We need a lawyer," she said. "One who handles international property claims." "I know. And a gemologist. Someone with credentials who can authenticate and appraise." "I know. And we need to deal with the Belgian company before they decide to stop watching from the road and try something else." "I know." Josie closed the sketchbook. She looked around the chamber one last time, at the cases on their shelves, at the ninth case on the table with its two-petal lock and its 11 exceptional stones. "She did the right thing," Josie said. "Grandma, keeping them." Renee looked at the dark walnut cases with the lily inlay catching the diffused light. "Yeah. She did it alone for a very long time." "She did. But she left it to you." Josie said it simply, as a fact rather than a comfort. "So you wouldn't have to do it alone." The chamber was quiet. Above them, through the trapdoor and through the greenhouse floor, the irrigation timer ran its cycle. Water moved through pipes to root systems that had been growing in Eleanor's care for decades. The climate unit on the east wall breathed steadily. Everything Eleanor had set in motion continued without her. Renee stood and moved to the archival file boxes on the shelving beside the cases. She opened the nearest one. Inside, binders, each labeled on the spine in handwriting that was not Eleanor's. Anton Velier's catalog, maintained across decades in the cramped, careful hand of someone for whom documentation was a form of protection. She lifted the first binder. Inside, photographs of individual stones, each one labeled with a reference number and a description in both English and French. Provenance notes in some cases. GI certificate numbers where certification existed. The photography was done on film, printed on paper that had aged at the edges to a soft cream, but the images were sharp, the details clear. Every stone recorded with the thoroughness of someone who understood that the record might someday be all that remained. She worked through the binders one by one, cross-referencing what she could see in the cases with what Velier had documented. The catalog was complete. Nothing missing, nothing left undescribed. 40 years of careful record-keeping in the service of ensuring that each stone could be identified, authenticated, and traced. The last binder in the box was thinner than the others. She pulled it out. Inside the front cover, folded once along the horizontal, was a letter on personal stationery. The letterhead read Anton Velier, New York. The date at the top was February 3rd, 1999, 8 months before he died. She read it standing there, Josie beside her with the flashlight. Anton had written to Eleanor the way a person writes to someone whose character they know without needing to test it. No preamble, no ceremony. He said his health was failing and he had made a decision he'd been considering for some time. The collection would go to her care, not because of any connection to the gem trade or any professional standing or any resources she had, because she was, in his experience, someone who kept her word. He told her about Velier Erfgode BV. He described who controlled it and what they believed they were owed and why their belief was wrong. He told her the notarized transfer agreement addressed their claim entirely, that there was no legal basis for what they would demand. But he also told her that documentation required someone willing to use it, and using it would mean announcing to everyone who cared that the collection existed and where it was. He told her to hold the documentation in reserve unless she had no other choice, to keep the door closed and stay quiet for as long as she could. He told her that someday the right person would come, someone with the capacity to take the collection out of hiding and into the public record where its legal ownership would become undeniable and uncontestable. He told her he did not know when or how that would happen, and he was sorry to leave her holding the weight of an open question. The last paragraph read, "Eleanor, you are the most careful person I have known in a long life spent among people who understood the value of careful. What I have given you was protected by others before me, at significant cost to themselves. I am placing it in your hands knowing it will be kept, and knowing that when the time comes you will find a way to put it in the right hands after yours. The letter was signed simply Anton. Renee folded it and returned it to the binder cover. She looked up at the trapdoor above them. The square of light where the greenhouse waited, the plants growing in their beds, the automated systems running. The right hands after yours. Anton had written it in February 1999, 8 months before he died, trusting that Eleanor would know when the time had come and would find a way to pass it forward. Eleanor had died in March without being able to say it directly, without being able to name the person or explain the thing she'd spent 22 years protecting. She'd left a key in the barn and a second key in a ceramic bowl and a letter on the kitchen table that said the greenhouse was the one thing that mattered. She'd trusted Renee to find the way in. Renee stood in a stone chamber under a Virginia greenhouse, surrounded by 9 walnut cases holding a collection that no one in the world officially knew the location of, with a notarized transfer agreement in her bag and a ring of specialized tools on a hook on the wall, and a Belgian holding company parking sedans on Copeland Road. She was a single mother with a second job cleaning office buildings. She had no expertise in gem law, international property claims, or high-value asset authentication. She had $38 in her checking account and an $11,000 tax debt, and a lease in Staunton that was already 2 months past when she told herself she'd find something better. None of those things had changed. But she was here, and she had found this, and she understood now with the particular clarity that came from seeing an actual thing instead of imagining it what her mother had been keeping and why, and what it was going to take to bring it into the light. She would need a lawyer. The kind Denise had described. Someone who understood international property claims and contested inheritance and the specific legal situation that a notarized transfer agreement created when a foreign holding company sent threatening letters. She would need a gemological expert, someone with GIA credentials and a reputation that would make any authentication she provided undeniable. She would need to move faster than the men who parked sedans on Copeland Road, before whatever they were building toward became something more direct. She had none of those things yet. She had 2 flashlights and a notebook and a phone full of photographs and a daughter sitting on a concrete floor sketching a red diamond from memory. It was enough to start. Time to go, Renee said. Josie closed the sketchbook without argument and stood. They climbed the ladder back up to the greenhouse, Renee going first and reaching back to take the sketchbook while Josie came up. She lowered the trapdoor behind them, heard the panel settle into its frame, and stood in the warm green air among the living plants while her eyes readjusted to the filtered afternoon light. She locked the greenhouse door behind them on the way out, both keys in the proper order, listening for the mechanism to re-engage. She tested the door. Solid. Sealed. Everything as it was. They walked back across the property toward the car in the late afternoon quiet. The woodpecker had started up again somewhere in the tree line at the back of the land. The same steady working sound that had been there on the first visit, as if it too had simply continued while they were away. Renee did not know yet, precisely, what $445 million looked like when it was appraised and authenticated and brought out of a stone chamber and into the world where it could be counted and named and defended. She did not know what the Belgian company's next move would be or how quickly she needed to act or how much legal protection was going to cost before the collection was secure. She knew this. She was not disclaiming the inheritance. She was not selling the land. She was not handing anything to anyone with a letterhead from Brussels. Her mother had kept a promise for 22 years. In a sealed building, in silence, with automated irrigation and a locked door and no explanation offered to any person who hadn't earned the right to one. Renee was going to find out who had the right to one now, and she was going to start making calls in the morning. The first call Renee made on Monday morning was to the Virginia State Bar Association's referral line. She explained what she needed. Cultural property law, international estate claims, something involving provenance from wartime Europe and a Belgian holding company with no legal standing she could yet prove. The woman on the other end was quiet for a moment, then gave her 2 names. One based in Richmond, the second in Washington, D.C. She called the D.C. number. Ellen Marsh had been a cultural property attorney for 24 years. Her office handled wartime art restitution cases, international museum disputes, and contested inheritance claims involving assets displaced by the last century's various catastrophes. Her assistant answered, took a summary of the call's nature, and put Renee on hold for 4 minutes. Then Ellen picked up. "Tell me what you have," she said. No greeting, just the point. Renee told her. All of it, in the order it had happened, without embellishment. The inheritance, the sealed greenhouse, the 2 keys, the chamber, the 9 walnut cases, Anton Velier's catalog and his notarized transfer agreement, the Belgian company's letters, the sedan on Copeland Road. When she finished, Ellen was quiet. "The notarized transfer agreement is dated 1999, Ellen said. "March 19th, with 2 witnesses." "Yes. And you have the physical document." "In a plastic sleeve in my bag." Another pause. "The Lelie Botanica collection." She said it the way someone said a name they'd heard before and were now placing in a new context. Anton Velier's collection has been listed as missing in cultural property registries since 2001. There have been 2 attempted claims through Belgian courts in that time, both dismissed for lack of evidence of location. Velier Erfgoed BV was the claimant in both cases. Renee sat very still. "You know about it. Anyone who works in this field knows about it. It's been one of the significant unresolved cases in post-war gem provenance for over 20 years. A pause. "Miss Calloway, if what you've described is accurate and documentable, this is not a small matter. I know. I need to see the transfer agreement. I need to see the collection. And I need to understand the physical space before anything is moved." Another pause. "I work regularly with a gemologist, Dr. Yael Brenner, GA certified, former Sotheby's. With your permission, I'd like to bring her." "Yes," Renee said. "This week, if possible. I don't know how much time you have before Velier Erfgoed files something more substantive than letters." They agreed on Thursday. Renee called Denise afterward. "I spoke to a lawyer. And she knows what the Lelie Botanica collection is. She said it's been listed as missing in cultural property registries since 2001. A long breath on Denise's end. "Renee, she's coming Thursday with a gemologist. Are you okay?" Renee looked at the photograph of Anton and Eleanor on Eleanor's kitchen table, where she'd been working every night this week. She looked at Josie's sketchbook open beside it, the drawing of the pink diamond on the right-hand page, made in a stone chamber under a flashlight from memory. "I think I'm going to be," she said. Ellen Marsh arrived on Thursday morning in a dark sedan with Dr. Yael Brenner in the passenger seat. Ellen was tall and somewhere in her 50s, with the organized calm of someone who spent her professional life inside complicated situations and had learned to take them one documented step at a time. Dr. Brenner was smaller and older, dressed practically. Carrying a case of equipment, she sat down in the gravel driveway with the care of someone who always set things down carefully. Josie was there. Renee had considered this and then stopped considering it, because Josie had been part of every step of finding this thing, and excluding her now would have been a kind of dishonesty that didn't belong in any of the choices Renee was making. Ellen reviewed the transfer agreement first at Eleanor's kitchen table. She read it twice, then photographed every page. She asked 3 questions about where it had been found, whether it had been removed from the property, and whether anyone else had handled it. Then she put it in her own protective sleeve alongside a copy, made on a small portable printer she'd brought. "This is sound," she said, without any particular emphasis. "The notarization is legitimate. The witnesses are traceable. Velier's signature is consistent with documented examples from that period." She looked at Renee. "Velier Erfgoed has no legal basis for their claim. They never had one. The question is whether they know that and are hoping you don't, or whether they genuinely believe the 1999 transfer was invalid." "Does it matter which?" Renee asked. "Not legally. It matters for predicting their next move." Ellen set the document aside. "Let's go see what we're dealing with." They walked to the greenhouse together, all 4 of them, across the April property in morning light. Dr. Brenner carried her equipment case. She said nothing on the walk, looking at the greenhouse from a distance with the expressionless focus of someone assessing rather than reacting. At the door, Renee used both keys in the proper order. The door opened on the warm green air, the same as it always did, the living smell of the automated system maintaining itself exactly as Eleanor had designed it to. Dr. Brenner paused in the doorway. "She kept them alive," she said. "Not to anyone in particular." An observation made aloud. "She automated everything," Renee said. "It's been running on its own." Dr. Brenner looked at the irrigation lines along the wall and the climate display near the door. Then she looked at the plants themselves. walking the first few feet of the center aisle with her eyes moving over the specimens in the raised beds. "These are old plants," she said. "Some of them. Some have been growing here since the 80s. A brief pause. Your mother understood what she was doing. They walked the center aisle to the far end. Renee lifted the trapdoor. Dr. Brenner looked down the ladder into the darkness below, then looked at Renee with an expression she kept professionally neutral. She descended first, carrying her equipment case, moving with the deliberate ease of someone accustomed to controlled storage environments. Renee came next, then Josie, then Ellen. The chamber looked different with 4 people in it. Smaller somehow, even though nothing had changed. Dr. Brenner set her case on the concrete floor and stood for a moment in the flashlight light, looking at the 9 walnut cases on the shelving and the table, looking at the climate unit on the east wall, looking at the archival file boxes and the hook where the tools hung. She picked up one of the tools from the hook, examined its tip, and set it back. Then she crossed to the first case on the shelving and opened it. She worked without hurrying. Opening each case and examining each stone with equipment, she pulled methodically from her case. A loop, then more precise instruments, a portable spectroscope, a thermal conductivity tester, a colorimeter she used on the most deeply saturated colored stones. She made notes after each case in a handwriting too small and too precise to read from where Renee stood watching. She didn't speak while she worked. Ellen sat on the concrete floor with Anton's catalog binders, cross-referencing her notes against the GIA certificate numbers Velier had recorded. She photographed every page. Josie sat with her sketchbook and drew. When Dr. Brenner reached the 6th case, the one on the low table at the center of the room, something changed in her face. A small change, the kind that came from professional composure containing something it hadn't quite expected. She fitted the 2-petal tool to the lock and opened the case and looked at the 11 stones in their individual velvet settings. She examined the pink diamond with her loupe for a long time, the blue with her spectroscope, the red with both instruments, and then a third she hadn't used yet. And then she set the instruments aside and looked at the red stone with nothing but the flashlight and her own eyes for a moment before writing in her notes. When she finished the 6th case, she sat back on her heels. "The pink is approximately 8. 4 carats," she said. "Fancy vivid pink. The cut is consistent with mid-century European work. The blue is 3. 2 carats. Fancy vivid blue, natural and untreated, clarity characteristics consistent with the Argyle origin Anton documented in the catalog." She paused. "The red diamond is 1 carats. Fancy red, unmodified, natural color." She looked at Renee. "I have seen 4 pure red diamonds in 28 years of practice. This is the 5th. No one spoke. "The full collection will require several weeks for complete appraisal," Dr. Brenner said. "The exceptional specimens alone will need independent laboratory verification through the GIA. But I can tell you what I'm looking at in general terms." She looked at Renee steadily. "This is a collection of international significance, not primarily a financial asset, though it has substantial financial value. It is a historical archive. Many of these stones came from collections documented before the war and lost during it. Some of their provenance can be traced through existing registries." "Anton's catalog traces some of them," Renee said. "Yes, I've been reading it." Ellen looked up from the binders. "Several of the provenance chains in this catalog connect to families that have been conducting formal searches through the Commission for Looted Art in Europe. There are heirs who have been looking for specific pieces that may be in this collection." Renee thought about what Anton had written in his letter. "What I have given you was protected by others before me." "We find them," Renee said. "The families. If the provenance can be traced, we find them." Ellen looked at her carefully. "That will reduce the collection's total value. I know. Some of these pieces could be worth significant amounts individually. I know. We find the families." Ellen held her gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once and made a note. "We'll run everything through the Commission's registry alongside the GIA process. It will add time. However long it takes," Renee said. They came up from the chamber in the late morning. Dr. Brenner stood at the top of the ladder for a moment and looked at the living plants before they walked out. Outside in the April light, she turned to Renee. "The appraisal will take approximately 6 weeks for the full collection. I'll need to remove select specimens for laboratory analysis, with full chain of custody documentation and everything insured in transit." "Yes," Renee said. "The figure, when we have it, is going to attract attention. Dr. Brenner looked at the greenhouse, at the dark panels and the sealed steel door and the ordinary gravel driveway and the overgrown land around it. This collection has been listed as missing for more than 20 years. When it surfaces, with full provenance documentation and clear legal ownership, it will be one of the most significant finds in the history of colored diamond collecting. She looked back at Renee. The attention will be significant. Renee nodded. Ellen was already walking toward the car, phone to her ear, making the call that would stop Velier Erfgoed before they had the chance to file anything. Christoph Hendricks, the Brussels attorney representing Velier Erfgoed BV, received Ellen's call that afternoon. He had been managing the company's claim to the Lelie Botanica collection for 11 years. He was practiced and precise and spoke English with the formal fluency of someone who had argued cases in 3 languages and found all of them equally serviceable. He told Ellen that his clients had a legitimate claim based on inheritance rights and a 1999 transaction conducted under circumstances the company believed to be legally questionable. Ellen told him she had the notarized transfer agreement, dated March 1999, witnessed and signed, transferring full legal custody of the collection to Eleanor Marie Calloway, with a statement in Velier's own hand attached. She told him she had documentation of every letter his clients had sent to Eleanor's estate. She told him she had photographs of a dark sedan parked repeatedly on Copeland Road, and a record from a local business owner describing a man claiming to represent a property assessment firm that did not exist when the county was contacted. Hendricks was quiet for a moment. He asked for copies of the transfer agreement. Ellen sent them within the hour. His response came the following morning in a single paragraph. His clients were reviewing the documentation and would be in contact. No further action would be taken in the immediate term. The injunction Velier Erfgoed had been preparing, a motion to prevent removal of any assets from the Calloway property pending ownership investigation, was never filed. It simply stopped existing, without announcement or acknowledgement, in the way that claims without legal foundation eventually stop existing when someone presents the documentation that ends them. 6 weeks later, Hendricks issued a formal statement through a Brussels law firm acknowledging that the 1999 transfer agreement was legally valid and withdrawing all claims. The statement made no mention of sedans on Copeland Road or men asking questions at a Greer's Mill convenience store. It was written in the careful language of an organization that had spent years asserting a claim that was never theirs, trying to close a door as quietly as it had tried to open one. Ellen put it in the file and moved on to the next thing. The GIA laboratory completed their analysis of the exceptional specimens in 5 weeks. Dr. Brenner delivered the preliminary figures on a Tuesday evening while Renee was sitting at Eleanor's kitchen table on Copeland Road, where she had been spending most weekends since the process began. Josie was doing homework at the other end of the table. Dr. Brenner went through the numbers the way she did everything, methodically, without drama, giving each figure the time it deserved. The 83 exceptional specimens. The pink diamond appraised at $87 million, reflecting its size, its color grade, and its Argyle origin at a time when Argyle production had permanently ended and no new stones of its quality could enter the market. The blue diamond at $64 million. The red at $41 million. The remaining 80 exceptional specimens, ranging from fancy intense to fancy vivid color grades, at a combined $108 million. The exceptional specimens alone, $300 million. The remaining 1,764 specimens, appraised across a further 3 weeks, $145 million. Total collection value, excluding the pieces set aside for restitution proceedings and already designated for return to identified family heirs, for $145 million. Renee held the phone and looked across the table at Josie, who had stopped writing and was watching her with complete stillness. "Thank you," Renee said to Dr. Brenner. "I'll call you in the morning." She set the phone on the table. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the property lay in the dark. The greenhouse sat at the back of the land, and inside it the irrigation was running its evening cycle, water moving through pipes to roots, the plants taking what they needed, everything continuing the way Eleanor had designed it to continue. $445 million, Josie said. Yes. She said it the same way she said most things, giving it the weight it deserved, not more. That's what Grandma was keeping. That's what she was keeping. For 22 years. Yes. Josie looked at the table for a moment. She was 13 now, having aged through the full span of what this had taken. She had the expression she wore when she'd been thinking about something for a long time and had arrived somewhere she was ready to put into words. She must have been lonely, Josie said. Renee looked at her daughter. She had always been too perceptive for most rooms. She was, Renee said. She chose to be. For something she believed mattered. Like Anton chose to be. Like Anton did. Josie picked up her pencil and went back to her homework. Returned to it cleanly and without fuss, the way she returned to everything she'd set down. The restitution process took 8 months. Ellen worked with the Commission for Looted Art in Europe, cross-referencing Anton's catalog against the databases of families who had been searching for displaced collections since the war ended. 3 family lines were identified. A family in Amsterdam whose grandfather had entrusted a set of colored sapphires to Anton in 1941 and died in 1943. His granddaughter was found through a genealogy registry, 81 years old, who had submitted claims to various cultural property registries for portions of her adult life without resolution. A Belgian family whose great-aunt had placed 2 specific diamonds with Anton in the spring of 1942. A young man drove from Bruges to Greer's Mill to see the documentation. He stood in Eleanor's kitchen and said very little. When he left, he held Renee's hand for a moment and said, in English with a Flemish accent, that his family had given up, that they had long since stopped believing the stones would surface. A French family who sent a letter. Their pre-war collection of rubies appeared in Anton's catalog with provenance notation that matched their own family records precisely. The letter was 2 pages and formal in the way French letters tended to be formal, and at the end of the second page the formality gave way briefly to something else, a single sentence that Renee read several times. We did not expect, in this generation, to receive what the last generation lost. Renee kept all 3 letters in the desk, in Eleanor's study, in the drawer where the legal documents had been. The public announcement came in September, 8 months after she had first gone down that ladder. Ellen managed the process, working with the GIA and a cultural property foundation in D.C. to ensure that when the story became public, it became public correctly, with full institutional backing that made the find undeniable and the legal ownership uncontestable. The press release went out on a Wednesday morning. By Wednesday afternoon, it was on the front pages of newspapers in 3 countries and the homepage of every significant art and culture publication in English and Dutch and French. By Thursday, it had reached morning television programs in 7 countries. Some coverage made it primarily about the money, because money was what certain outlets understood. But the coverage that lasted, the pieces that were reported carefully and read widely, was about something else. About Anton Vellier and what he had spent his life protecting. About the families who had been searching for pieces of their history for 80 years and had now found them. About a woman in rural Virginia who had kept a sealed greenhouse for 22 years because the person she trusted most had asked her to, and who had never told anyone, not even her own daughter, because telling anyone would have put the whole thing at risk. Eleanor's photograph appeared in more than a dozen publications. The one from the study, the one that had been lying face down on the desk when Renee first came in and turned it over. Anton and Eleanor in a greenhouse in 1998, neither of them looking at the camera, both of them looking at something outside the frame that clearly mattered. It became, as certain images do, the picture that defined the story for people who hadn't been there. 2 people in a greenhouse, doing something important, without anyone watching. Harold Pruitt called the day the story broke. He was professional and measured, which Renee respected. He said he wished he had understood the scope of what was involved when he first called her about the estate. He said he was glad she had not disclaimed the inheritance. Renee thanked him and moved the conversation toward the legal questions he was actually calling about, because there were several. Denise called that evening. I'm standing in the break room at Mercer's, Denise said, looking at your name on the news on my phone. And I just want to say I told you to go. Renee laughed. It came out slightly unsteady, the way laughter did when it was covering several things at once. I didn't tell you it would be this, Denise said. But I told you to go. You did. Are you okay? I think I'm going to be. The same answer she'd given months ago, and still true, and more true now in a different way. Owen, the man from the convenience store in Greer's Mill, was one of the first people in town to see the news story. She found out later that he'd printed a copy and put it on the corkboard beside the counter, between the flyers for fishing licenses and lost animals, without comment. Not because he wanted recognition for anything. Because the people of Greer's Mill had talked about Eleanor Calloway for 22 years and had never known what they were actually talking about, and he thought they should. When Renee drove through town the following week on the way to Copeland Road, she stopped at the store. He was behind the counter as he always was. "I saw you put the article up," she said. He shrugged with the economy of a man who didn't require credit for things he'd done for the right reason. "People around here talked about your mother for years. Figured they should know the story." Renee bought 2 bottles of water and drove the rest of the way to Copeland Road. The decision about the collection took 3 months of conversation with Ellen and Dr. Brenner and a financial advisor Ellen recommended. At the end of those 3 months, Renee had a framework she understood and could stand behind. The restituted pieces went to their families with full documentation. That was not a decision. That was the completion of what Anton had started. The remaining 1,764 pieces entered a formal partnership with the GIA and the Cultural Property Foundation in D.C. A traveling exhibition would document the full collection for 5 years, allowing institutions across North America and Europe to present it publicly for the first time. After the exhibition, Renee retained ownership. She did not sell the collection. She sold a portion. 8 pieces. Not the exceptional specimens, not the stones with significant historical provenance, but 8 colored diamonds in calibrated commercial grades that the market absorbed without ceremony. The proceeds were specific and purposeful. She paid the property taxes on the Copeland Road land. All of it, current and in arrears, settled in full. She paid off the loan she had taken to cover the back taxes when she first inherited. The one at 18% APR from the lender who had smiled the way people smiled when they believed someone had no other options. She paid off the credit card balance Daniel had left behind, the one she had been paying minimum amounts on for 2 years while the balance barely moved. She paid Josie's school fees through the end of high school with money set aside for what came after that as well. Then she hired contractors to repair the Copeland Road house. Not to renovate it into something it wasn't. To fix what needed fixing. The porch, which had gone soft in the corner. The roof, which had been losing ground for years. The thermostat Eleanor had noted in the letter. A bathroom ceiling that had been giving way slowly for as long as Renee had been coming here. She restored it to what Eleanor had built it to be. Well-made and practical, and suited to someone who lived there with intention. Then she gave notice on the apartment in Staunton and moved to Copeland Road with Josie. Josie carried her own boxes in without being asked. She had already chosen her bedroom, the one with the view of the back of the property, and had asked about putting a desk near the window. From that window, you could see the greenhouse. The one thing Renee changed about the greenhouse was the panels. She hired a specialist to remove the dark film from the interior surface of the glass. It came off cleanly, because it had been applied to be removed someday, which meant Eleanor had always understood that the door would eventually open permanently, not just to the right person, but to the right moment. The work took 3 days. On the morning of the 4th day, Renee unlocked the greenhouse door and stepped inside. The light was different. Not the filtered, diffused green of the last 22 years. Real light. Morning light, coming through clear glass at the angle it had been designed to come through, falling across the raised beds and the hanging baskets and the center aisle with the direct warmth of actual sunlight. The green of the leaves was different in this light. Sharper. More specific. Each plant distinct in a way the filtered light had softened into generality. The irrigation ran. The climate system ran. The plants grew. As they had grown for decades. As they would continue to grow as long as someone maintained what Eleanor had built to maintain them. Renee walked the center aisle and let the light come through. She stopped at the far end, at the workbench where Eleanor's tools were still arranged in their organized rows. The corkboard was bare now. The maps and photographs and newspaper clippings had all been carefully removed and archived with Ellen for documentation purposes, their part in the story complete. But the corkboard itself remained, same size, same position above the workbench. Renee had brought something from the house. The photograph from the study, the one that had been lying face down on the desk when she first arrived, that she had put in her jacket pocket and carried through everything that followed. She had it framed now, simple black frame, nothing elaborate. Anton and Eleanor in a greenhouse in 1998, not looking at the camera, looking at something that mattered. She pinned it to the center of the corkboard. She stood looking at it for a moment. Her mother's face in that rare, open expression. The white-haired man beside her, intent, his eyes on whatever both of them were looking at. Two people who had built something together in the only way either of them knew how. Without announcement. Without asking anyone's permission or explaining themselves to anyone who hadn't earned the right to an explanation. By deciding what mattered and then doing the work to protect it for as long as it took, with whatever was available to them. Josie appeared in the doorway of the greenhouse. She looked at the corkboard, at the photograph pinned in the center. Then she came and stood beside Renee the way she always had, close enough to be present without requiring anything. She had her sketchbook under her arm. "Can I put something else up there?" she asked. "What?" Josie opened the sketchbook and carefully removed a page. The drawing of the pink diamond, made in the chamber on the concrete floor by flashlight from memory, which she had been working on and refining in the months since. The original sketch had been developed and shaded into something that captured not just the shape of the stone, but something essential about its character. The way it seemed to hold light rather than simply reflect it. "There's room," Josie said. Renee took the drawing and pinned it on the corkboard beside the photograph. The diamond beside the two people who had spent their lives protecting it. "It's good," Renee said. "I've been working on it for months." They stood in the greenhouse together in the morning light. The clear, real light coming through unfiltered glass for the first time in 22 years. The irrigation ran. The plants grew. The photograph and the drawing hung on the empty corkboard at the back wall where decades of documentation had accumulated and then been resolved and taken away, their work done. Renee thought about Eleanor in the original lean-to, saying the Latin names of seedlings aloud. Patient, exact, without decoration. Just the fact of the living thing and its proper name. She thought about a man in a Manhattan apartment in the last year of his life, writing a letter to a woman in rural Virginia who kept her promises, asking her to hold something until the right person came to take it forward. She thought about 22 years of a sealed door and an automated irrigation system and 14 months of back taxes and a letter left on a kitchen table with the R written too large. She thought about Josie in the car on the first drive out, asking if Renee had liked Eleanor, and Renee saying they were too similar, and Josie saying that sounds lonely. She had found this, not through expertise or prior knowledge or any resource that made it easy. She had found it because she came when the call arrived, even though the call was vague, even though coming made no practical sense, even though the numbers didn't work and the property was worth less than the debt attached to it, and the people who had opinions about the matter thought she was taking on more than she could carry. She had come because it was her mother's. Because a letter said the greenhouse was the one thing that mattered. Because a note at the bottom of a ceramic bowl said for when you're ready, and she had decided she was. 3 families had pieces of their history back after 80 years. A man named Anton Vellier, who had died without his work being understood, was now understood. His collection was documented and authenticated and protected in a way that would outlast any single person's ability to protect it alone. And Eleanor Calloway, who had never explained herself to anyone and had never needed to, was known now. Not as a figure of public drama. Not as an eccentric or a recluse or someone who had gone strange in a sealed greenhouse on a rural Virginia road. As someone who had done what she said she would do. As someone who had kept what she was given to keep. As someone who grew things. The light moved through the greenhouse. The plants did what they had always done. Renee stood in the space her mother had built and maintained and sealed and left, and she felt the particular, quiet weight of a thing understood too late, but understood completely. The grief of it was real. The warmth of it was also real. Both were true at once, and she let both be true. She was going to learn the names of these plants. All of them. The Latin ones, the ones Eleanor had known since before Renee could read, that she had said aloud in the lean-to on cold mornings when Renee was 7 years old and couldn't yet understand why precision with names mattered. She understood now. She was going to walk this center aisle every morning and know what she was walking past. Know what each plant needed and what it was called and how long it had been growing here and what her mother had thought of it. She owed that, at least, to the woman who had spent decades in this space with these living things, who had loved them the way she loved everything she was responsible for, without ceremony, without requiring anyone to notice. It seemed like the right place to start. The field journals were on the study shelf in chronological order from left to right. which was how Eleanor organized everything she could organize. 47 spiral notebooks spanning from 1974 to 2021. The final one, open to its last entry dated 11 days before Eleanor died, contained a single line in handwriting that had grown larger with age and illness. Check the irrigation. Everything running. Renee found this on a Sunday morning in November, 1 month after moving to Copeland Road. She had come to the study to find the name of a plant she'd seen in the greenhouse that morning, a small orchid in a terracotta pot on the second shelf from the left that had developed a new spike overnight and that she wanted to identify properly. She pulled the most recent journal from the shelf to look for it and found the last entry first. She stood at the desk for a long time with the journal open. Check the irrigation. Everything running. Eleanor's final documented act had been to confirm that the automated systems protecting what was in the chamber below were still functioning. Dying 11 days from the end, she had gone to the greenhouse and checked, made the note, then gone back inside. Renee sat down at the desk and began reading from the beginning. The first journal was from 1974, the year Eleanor moved to Copeland Road. The entries were observational in the precise way all of Eleanor's things were observational. Dates, weather, what was planted, how things were progressing. The writing was spare and exact. Small pencil drawings appeared occasionally in the margins, individual leaf shapes or root systems sketched quickly and labeled. The journals read the way Eleanor's garden books read, not as diaries in any common sense, not as repositories of feeling, but as records of paying close attention to living things. The closer Renee read, the more she began to hear what was underneath the observations. February 9th, 1976. First hard frost. Lost the 2 Echinopsis I'd been nursing since September. I should have brought them under cover earlier. I knew the weather was turning. I waited too long on a decision I had already made. March 14th, 1983. Cold this morning, but clear. Planted out the Cypripedium parviflorum seedlings, 3rd attempt at this species. Watched from the porch for a while before she went to school. She did not ask what I was planting. She just watched. She's going to ask eventually. I want to have a better answer than the Latin name. Renee stopped at this entry and read it 3 times. She was 9 years old in March 1983. She had no memory of standing on the porch watching Eleanor plant. But she must have stood there. The entry made it real. Eleanor had looked up from the cold soil and registered her daughter on the porch and thought, not about the plant, but about how to explain it. She had not explained it. That was the record. She'd wanted a better answer and hadn't found one, and the moment had passed, and they'd moved on the way they moved on from everything, quietly and without resolution. She kept reading. The journals from Renee's childhood had these moments scattered through them, infrequent and never announced, the way Eleanor treated everything she considered important. A sentence noting that Renee had come home from school with a particular expression Eleanor recognized and had considered asking about and then decided against. A note that Renee had helped in the greenhouse without being asked one April afternoon and had done it well, and Eleanor had not said so. A brief record of the evening Renee announced she was leaving for Charlottesville, written as, is leaving in August. Good. Just that. Good. 2 pages later, an entry from the following week. The Echinopsis seeds I have been stratifying are ready to plant. I'll put them in the bed nearest the back wall where they can be seen from R.'s window in the mornings. Renee had left in August. Eleanor had planted something that could be seen from her window. She closed the journal after an hour and sat with her hands in her lap in the quiet of Eleanor's study. She went back the next Sunday, and the one after that, reading through the decades methodically, not rushing the process, letting each year accumulate its own weight. The journals from the early 1990s were different in character. Still precise, still observational, but something had entered the prose that hadn't been there before. The name Anton appeared for the first time in a November 1993 entry. Lelie came to see the greenhouse this afternoon. He had heard of the slipper orchid collection through someone at the Botanical Society. He spent an hour and a half. He asked good questions. Then nothing for several months. Then, visited again. He brought cuttings from a dendrobium species I have been looking for since 1986. He knew where to find it without being asked. The friendship developed across the journals the same sideways, undramatic way Eleanor recorded everything else. Anton appearing with cuttings or questions or sources she hadn't found. Eleanor noting what he understood, what he observed. By 1996, the entries carried a different weight. A. was here for 3 days. We worked through the propagation problem with the Masdevallia. He understands patience the same way I do, which is rare. By 1998, the entries about Anton made Renee slow down and read twice. October 3rd, 1998. A came this week. He is not well, though he will not say so directly. He showed me the catalog. All of it, which he has not done before. 1,847 specimens. He has been keeping this record for 50 years. He went through every page, and I sat with him. It took 2 days. He did not explain why he was showing me. I did not ask. I already knew. November 17th, 1998. A called this afternoon. He asked, very simply, if I would keep it. I said yes. He said he would send the documentation in the spring. I said I would find a place. He thanked me, and we spoke about something else. Renee sat with that entry for a long time. Her mother had agreed. On a November afternoon in 1998, in the same plain manner she agreed to everything that mattered to her, to spend the rest of her life protecting a collection worth hundreds of millions of dollars. She had said yes the way she said everything, without ceremony, without requiring the full picture to be explained first. She already knew. The sealing entry was in a March 2002 journal, 3 years after Anton died. The surrounding entries were ordinary, plant observations, weather, notes on the irrigation system Eleanor was installing at the back of the greenhouse. And then, on March 21st, 2002, sealed the greenhouse today. Irrigation running. Temperature stable. The door is locked, and the keys are where they need to be. I expect this will be for some time. That was all. Renee read it twice, and then set the journal flat on the desk and pressed her palms against the cover. I expect this will be for some time. 22 years. Eleanor had written it the way she wrote everything. As though the difficulty of it was not the point. As though 22 years of keeping a sealed door between the world and what she was protecting was simply the duration required, and the duration was what you accepted when you had agreed to do the thing. Renee put the journal back on the shelf and went to make tea and stood at the kitchen window looking at the greenhouse. The clear panels let the November light in now, and through them she could see the shapes of the plants she was learning to name one by one. She thought she was beginning, at her age, to understand her mother. Not all of it. Probably not most of it. But the shape of it. The logic that ran through a life built around what was owed, and what was worth protecting, and what it cost to be the kind of person who paid debts without requiring anyone to know the payment was being made. Eleanor had been lonely in the choosing. The journals made that plain across decades of sideways entries. But she had not regretted the choice. Good. She had written when Renee left for Charlottesville. And then she had planted something that could be seen from the window. The call from Lisbeth van den Berg came on a Thursday evening in January. Renee was in the greenhouse when her phone rang, doing what she had taken to doing in the early evenings, moving through the center aisle slowly with Eleanor's 1985 journal open in one hand and a pocket plant guide in the other, matching Latin names to labeled specimens. She had been doing this for 2 months and had identified, definitively, perhaps a third of what Eleanor grew. The rest was still ahead of her. The number was Dutch. She almost didn't answer. She answered. The voice was elderly and careful, English spoken with the precision of someone for whom it had been a working language for 60 years rather than a first language. Miss Calloway, this is Lisbeth van den Berg. You will not remember me, but I was in contact with your lawyer, Mrs. Marsh, about the sapphires. Renee stepped out of the greenhouse into the cold January air. Ms. van den Berg. Yes, I know who you are. I wanted to call you directly, to say thank you. A pause. I have been saying thank you to Mrs. Marsh, but I wanted to say it to you. You don't need to thank me. The stones were your family's. Yes. Another pause, the kind that carried something behind it. They were my grandmother's, specifically. My grandfather bought them for her in 1928, for their wedding. There is a photograph of her wearing them. The only photograph I have of her from before the war. She stopped briefly. I have spent most of my adult life believing they were gone, that there was no point in searching anymore. Renee stood outside in the January dark with the greenhouse lit behind her. I'm glad we found them, she said, and meant it in a way the words didn't quite hold. I want to tell you something, Lisbeth said, about Mr. Vellier, since you are the person who found what he left. She paused. My grandfather trusted him in 1941 when trusting anyone was very difficult. He told my grandmother that Velier was the only person in that world who he believed would still be who he said he was when everything was over. Another pause. My grandfather was right, but he did not survive to know it. My mother did not survive to know it. Renee closed her eyes briefly against the cold. I know it, Lisbeth said. And I know it because of the woman who kept them safe after Mr. Velier could no longer do so himself. Your mother. A long pause. I would like you to know that my grandmother's name was Clara. Clara van den Berg, born Hartog. She died in 1944. She never knew what happened to the stones. But I know, and that matters to me more than I can say in a language that is not my first. They spoke for another hour. Not about the stones, after that, but about other things. Lisbeth's 40 years of teaching school in Amsterdam. Her garden, where she grew vegetables and some flowers, and a question about what Renee was growing on the Virginia property. Renee told her about Eleanor's greenhouse, the orchids, the propagation history, the automated irrigation that had kept everything alive. Lisbeth listened and said that anyone who kept plants running after their own death had understood something important about continuity. After the call ended, Renee stood outside for a while longer. Clara van den Berg, born Hartog, died 1944. A woman who had never known. Anton had known. He'd kept the record, every stone identified and documented and cross-referenced, the provenance traceable for exactly this reason, so that someday someone might be able to say her name. Renee went back inside and wrote it in the margin of the greenhouse notebook she'd started keeping. Clara. She put the date beside it and went back to the plants. Owen had come by the property once in December, unannounced, which was how things tended to happen in Greer's mill. He was driving past on the way to somewhere else and had pulled into the driveway because the greenhouse light was on at an unusual hour and he wanted to make sure nothing was wrong. He had a container of something his wife had made that there was extra of. This was the stated reason for stopping, which was partially true. Renee made coffee. They sat at Eleanor's kitchen table. Did you know her? Renee asked after a while. Beyond the store. Owen wrapped his hands around the mug. Slightly. She came in 2 or 3 times a week. Bought coffee and took it to go. Didn't usually stop to talk. He paused. But there was something she did for years. I don't know if you knew about it. Renee shook her head. She used to pay for whoever was behind her in line. Just the coffee or whatever they had. Nothing big. She'd pay for her own and pay for the next person without saying anything to them and be out the door before they even knew. Did it for years. He looked at the tabletop. First time I noticed, I thought it was a mistake. After that I watched for it. He shrugged with the economy of a man who didn't need the story to have a grander point than it already had. She just did it. Every time. Without making anything of it. Renee thought about the field journals. The entries describing things Eleanor had done or decided, each one recorded the same way. As fact. Without requiring acknowledgement. She would have done it exactly that way, Renee said. I know. That's why I'm telling you. After Owen left, Renee stood at the kitchen sink looking out the window at the dark property. Eleanor had bought coffee for strangers 2 or 3 times a week for years. She had done it the way she did everything. Without explanation. Without requiring anyone to know it was her. Every person who had ever stood behind Eleanor Calloway in that line and found their coffee already paid for had received something from a woman they might have called eccentric or strange, or the one with the sealed greenhouse. They hadn't known what they were receiving or from whom. Renee thought this was exactly right. It was exactly the kind of thing Eleanor would have done and exactly the manner in which she would have done it. The traveling exhibition opened in Washington, D.C. in the spring, 14 months after Renee had first gone down the ladder in the greenhouse. The GIA and the Cultural Property Foundation had worked with a design team to create a presentation that honored both the stones and the story behind them. Not a standard gem display, locked cases under bright lights with clinical catalog cards. Something different. The cases were exhibited in their original walnut form, open under lighting designed to approximate the quality of natural daylight, the stones visible in their velvet settings exactly as Anton had arranged them. The wall text told the full story. Anton Velier, his work in wartime Belgium, the decades of assembly and documentation, the families who had entrusted collections to his care during the occupation, the restitution of identified pieces to 3 heirs, and Eleanor Calloway, whose photograph was printed at full size on one wall of the exhibition space. Anton and Eleanor in a greenhouse in 1998, neither of them looking at the camera. Renee and Josie attended the opening evening. Josie was 14 now. In the dark dress she wore for things she was taking seriously, her sketchbook in her bag. She moved through the exhibition with the same focused quiet she'd brought to every space in this story. Gathering. Looking. The room with the exceptional specimens was smaller than the main space, which was intentional. The sixth case sat on its table under focused light, open, the 11 stones in their velvet settings. The pink diamond, the blue, the red, and the other 8 beside them, each one fully visible for the first time in a space designed for visibility. Renee stood in front of the case. She had seen these stones first by flashlight, in a stone chamber under a greenhouse, with her hands unsteady and her daughter sitting on the concrete floor behind her. She had seen them by portable spectroscope and by the light of Ellen's printer and by GA laboratory photography. She had not seen them like this. The pink diamond under proper museum lighting was different. Not more beautiful in any simple sense. Different in kind. The color did something under the focused light that the flashlight beam hadn't fully shown, a depth of saturation that seemed to shift with the angle of observation without the stone itself moving. The red looked smaller than she remembered, which was impossible since nothing had changed, but in the context of proper display it was more contained, more specific, a thing that had its full character compressed into something barely larger than a child's fingernail. Josie came to stand beside her. "It looks different," Josie said. "I know. It's the light." Partly it was the context. In the chamber it had been a secret, held in the dark by an automated system and a sealed door and a woman who'd agreed to keep it. Here it was a fact. A public, documented, historical fact, in a case with provenance notes and a GA certificate and the name of every person who had ever been responsible for it. Going back to the families who had placed it in Anton's care in the years when placing something in someone else's care was all that stood between a family history and its erasure. A young woman approached Renee, identifying herself with a small foundation badge. She worked for the Commission for Looted Art in Europe and had been working alongside Ellen on the restitution portion of the collection. "Miss Calloway, I wanted to tell you something you may not know yet." "Tell me," Renee said. "Anton Vellier's catalog has opened 3 additional provenance trails that we've been able to trace to other collections. Not stones in this collection. Pieces in other institutions and private holdings that appeared in the pre-war documentation Vellier referenced in his notes. His record-keeping was specific enough that we can use it as a source document even for things he never held directly." She looked at the case. 3 additional family claims have been filed in the last month that would not have been possible without the catalog surfacing. More may follow. Renee looked at her. "The find keeps giving," the young woman said simply. "I thought you should know." After the opening, Renee and Josie walked out into the spring evening in D.C., the streets carrying the usual noise and movement of a city at night, the kind of density that made Greer's Mill feel even quieter by comparison. Josie had her sketchbook out before they reached the car. Drawing from memory, Renee saw when she glanced over the exhibition room, the lit case, the arrangement of exceptional stones. "I want to work on something like this," Josie said without looking up. What they did with the exhibition, the documentation, the provenance research, the way it connects objects and people, and what gets lost and what gets found. She looked up briefly. "I want to study it properly. I've been thinking about it for months." "I know. You know? I've been watching you think about it since October." Josie went back to drawing. Renee walked through the spring city and thought about a 14-year-old who had sat on a concrete floor in a sealed chamber and drawn the layout of 9 walnut cases by flashlight, who had noticed the glass was dark from 200 yards, who had found 2 keyholes where other eyes saw one, who had looked at a pink diamond for 10 minutes and then drawn it from memory with the specific quality of its light. Some things ran in families, not only the difficult ones. Back on Copeland Road, the spring came to the property with the particular abundance of a Virginia spring, early and assertive and green in ways that made the winter look like a misunderstanding. The greenhouse held it differently now with clear panels. Real light fell across the raised beds and the hanging baskets at the angle and intensity the plants had been built by evolution to receive. Renee noticed changes in the weeks after the panels cleared. Growth rates shifting. Some species flowering earlier. A climbing plant on. A frame in the left rear of the space that had not bloomed in the 2 months she'd been tending it came into flower in late March, producing clusters of pale yellow she found on a Tuesday morning and stood looking at for a while. She had identified it the week before from the field journal and the plant guide. Quisqualis indica, Eleanor had written in a 1987 entry. Rangoon creeper. Stubborn about blooming if the light isn't right. Will sulk for years. Worth waiting. 2 words. Worth waiting. Written by Eleanor in 1987 about a plant that had now been waiting under the wrong light for 22 years. It had bloomed. Josie had taken responsibility for the masdevallia in the far right corner of the second growing bed, the species that Anton's first catalog visit had apparently prompted Eleanor to acquire, and which had been the subject of numerous journal entries across the years about its requirements for very specific temperature ranges and humidity levels, and the difficulty of keeping both stable without direct attention. It had survived the sealed years, the automated system maintaining exactly what it needed. But it had not bloomed since Eleanor became too ill to fine-tune the conditions herself. Josie read the relevant journal entries and spent 2 weeks researching the species and then made a small adjustment to the climate unit's programming. An evening temperature modification. A fraction of a degree. She did not tell Renee she was doing this. Renee found out when Josie appeared in the doorway of the study one morning in April and said, without preamble, that the masdevallia was blooming. They went together to look. The flowers were small and triangular, in shades of dark burgundy and orange that had no business being that specific or that vivid on something so small. The plant looked like it had been waiting to do this for years. Which, of course, it had. Grandma would have written an entry about this, Josie said. 1 sentence, Renee said. Something exact. Josie smiled. The smile she had when she thought something was right rather than when something was funny. Renee had started her own notebook. Not a field journal in Eleanor's mode. Not that precise or that technically grounded, not yet. A working notebook, where she recorded what she was learning and what she was still uncertain about and what she needed to look up. More provisional than Eleanor's record-keeping and more personal, which felt right. She was not Eleanor. She was learning from Eleanor, which was a different thing, and the difference would always show in the pages. In March, she called the Greer's Mill Historical Society, whose contact information she'd found on the bulletin board at Owen's store. They met on Wednesday evenings in the back room of the library. She went once and found 8 people ranging in age from 40 to 80 who spent their evenings preserving the documentary history of the valley. Agricultural records, family archives, old photographs, local newspaper records going back to 1902. Eleanor's name appeared in their records 3 times. Once in a 1990 land assessment. Once in a 2001 entry about a donation of archival plant specimens to the Shenandoah Botanical Collection, and once in a handwritten note in the meeting records from 2003. Calloway has donated the original construction drawings for the 1988 greenhouse structure to the Society Archive. She declined to attend in person, but says we are welcome to them. She had donated the greenhouse drawings. In 2003, the year after she sealed it, Eleanor had donated the construction plans for the structure she had just locked. The drawings of the exact building she was now protecting. Renee understood why, after reading 47 journals worth of how her mother's mind worked. Eleanor had been covering contingencies, so that if anything happened to her, if everything in the chamber were somehow lost, there would be at least a document in the public record showing what the structure was, what its dimensions were, what someone looking for something beneath its floor might need to know about how it was built. Eleanor had maintained every option for every outcome, including the ones she hoped would never arise. Renee attended the Historical Society meetings through April and into May. She brought Eleanor's field journals and began, with the group's careful help, to archive them properly. Digitized copies, cross-referenced against the Botanical Society's records and the documentation from the exhibition. Eleanor's record of 47 years of growing things becoming part of the documentary history of the valley she had lived in for most of her adult life. The society members treated the journals with the attention they gave everything they considered worth preserving, which was most things. One of the older members, a woman named Patricia who had grown up 2 roads over from Copeland Road and was in her late 70s, had a memory of Eleanor that she shared during a May meeting. She came to my mother's funeral, Patricia said. They had been looking at the 1987 journal entries. They weren't close friends. My mother mentioned her occasionally, said she was very considerate, but I hadn't known them to be real friends. I didn't expect to see her there. A pause. She sat at the back and left before anyone could speak to her. Renee thought about this on the drive home. Eleanor attending a near stranger's funeral alone and leaving before anyone could thank her for coming. She had read something in one of the journals, an October 1986 entry. Invited to the Harlans for dinner last week. M. Harlan asks good questions. A rare quality. M. Harland. Margaret, probably. Patricia's mother. Eleanor had attended the funeral of a woman who asked good questions. She had sat in the back and left without being seen because she wasn't there for acknowledgement. She was there because she considered it owed. This was Eleanor. Entire. The precise calibration of what was owed and what was not. The commitment to paying what was owed without requiring anyone to know the debt was being settled. She had spent 22 years paying the debt she owed Anton. The greenhouse was full in June. The Rangoon creeper was climbing its frame with the energy of a plant that had been waiting for the right conditions, producing new growth in visible increments each week. The Masdevallia bloomed twice in the first month, and Josie had begun keeping her own notebook about it, a small green spiral notebook from the store in town, in which she wrote observations with the same precise care Eleanor had written hers. More personal than Eleanor's entries, more willing to name what she was feeling about what she was observing, but specific, grounded in the thing itself rather than in the feeling about the thing. Eleanor would have recognized it. Renee stood in the greenhouse on a June evening when the last light came through the clear panels at the angle that made everything look finished rather than ending. The warm evening air carried the smell she understood now was not one smell, but dozens of them. Every species contributing something specific, layered into a whole that belonged to this space and no other on Earth. She thought about Lisbeth van den Berg in Amsterdam, who had her grandmother's sapphires, who had said "I know it now," in a language that was not her first. She thought about the young French family and their letter, what the last generation lost. She thought about the Belgian family, the young man from Bruges who had held her hand at the end and said his family had given up, that they had long since stopped believing. She thought about Anton Vellier in 1999, dying in a Manhattan apartment, knowing the collection was safe, knowing Eleanor would keep it, knowing he was leaving her with the weight of an open question, but trusting her to carry it until the right moment arrived. She thought about her mother, who had never found the way to say the important things directly and had spent her entire life saying them through other means. Through the plants she grew and tended and learned the Latin names of with the same seriousness she brought to everything she considered herself responsible for. Through a letter left on a kitchen table and a key in a barn and a note at the bottom of a ceramic bowl. Through an irrigation system designed to keep running after she was gone and greenhouse drawings donated to the Historical Society in 2003 and coffee paid for in a small-town convenience store 2 or 3 times a week for years, never once staying long enough to be thanked. The photograph of Anton and Eleanor was still pinned to the corkboard at the back of the greenhouse. Josie's drawing of the pink diamond beside it. The corkboard that had held decades of maps and documentation and newspaper clippings was mostly empty now, just the photograph and the drawing and the space around them. Renee had brought something from the study to add. One of Eleanor's pressed plant specimens, taken from the back of the 1983 journal where Eleanor had pressed and labeled it, Cypripedium parviflorum. The slipper orchid she'd been trying to grow since Renee was 9 years old. She pinned it carefully below the photograph, flat against the corkboard. She thought about the final entry in Eleanor's 1983 journal about the Cypripedium parviflorum, recorded in October. Third attempt failed. I will try again in the spring. Some things require more patience than I have given them so far. She had kept trying. The species appeared at intervals across the following decades, each attempt recorded without self-pity and without dramatizing the difficulty. In 1997, there were 2 sentences. The Cypripedium finally rooted. Took 14 years. 14 years of trying before it took. Renee looked at the pressed specimen on the corkboard, the photograph above it, Josie's drawing beside it. Eleanor had given Renee this property without knowing precisely what Renee would do with it. She had trusted her to make the right decisions the same way Anton had trusted Eleanor. She had left the keys and the letter and the note that said "for when you're ready," and she had left 47 years of field journals, and she had left the greenhouse full of living plants maintained by a system built to outlast her. She had left, in other words, everything she knew how to leave. All of it true to who she was. Renee reached up and touched the edge of the photograph very lightly, the way she might have touched her mother's shoulder if that had been a thing she'd known how to do when there was still time to do it. She had been handed a sealed greenhouse on 6.5 acres of rural Virginia land, 14 months of back taxes in arrears, and $38 in a checking account. She had opened the door, not because she had expertise or resources or any advantage that made the opening easy, because a letter on a kitchen table said the greenhouse was the one thing that mattered, and because a note at the bottom of a ceramic bowl said for when you're ready, and because she had decided she was, and because her daughter had looked at the dark glass from 200 yards and said, "Mom, the glass is dark," and because some things don't stay buried and some doors don't stay sealed, and some kinds of care outlast the person who first practiced them. Clara van den Berg, born Hartog, had her sapphires found 80 years later. 3 more families had traces of their history returned through trails opened by a catalog Anton Vellier spent 50 years maintaining. Eleanor Calloway, who never explained herself to anyone and had never needed to, was known now. Quietly. Specifically, in the way she would have preferred. Not as a celebrity or a figure of public drama. As someone who kept what she was given to keep. As someone who bought strangers coffee and attended funerals and planted things that could be seen from windows and spent 22 years in faithful maintenance of a sealed room, running automated irrigation and checking the temperature and making the note in November of her final year. Check the irrigation. Everything running. As someone who grew things. The last light left the greenhouse panels and the space settled into the particular blue of an early summer evening. Josie appeared in the doorway with her green notebook under one arm, her sketchbook under the other, and a question about one of the hanging baskets she was planning to check in the morning. Renee answered the question. They stood together in the doorway for a moment before going inside, looking at the living greenhouse in the evening, at everything Eleanor had planted and tended and automated and protected, and finally, at the end, left for the right pair of hands. The irrigation timer clicked on in the wall. Water moved through the pipes. The plants took what they needed. Everything running. Stories like this remind us that starting over is terrifying, but it is always possible. If you or someone you love is facing a total reset right now, whether from a divorce, a loss, or a financial disaster, you need a plan. Scan the QR code on your screen or click the link below to get the Phoenix Blueprint for just $17. It gives you the exact steps you need to take in the first 48 hours and a 90-day plan to get your independence back. Thank you for watching.